Okay, so, well, we didn't have anything scheduled for today, and I thought it was a good opportunity to go back to the stuff that we were already that we already covered, and try to systematize things a bit. But I try to do it, as I said here, as a rough account of what we've been up to, but for the benefit of others. And what do I mean by this? First, of course, being a rough account also means it's just like my perspective on this. I don't think it's definitely I'm overemphasizing parts of the project that I've been directly involved in, I'll try to connect, and I hope we can try to do this as we go along with other stuff that is circulating around. But I've tried to not really base it on my research, but base it on the discussions and presentations. But what I call for benefit of others is simply try to do it assuming the least common framework and terminology as a given. And also because I think that, I don't think this will do it. I don't think this presentation will accomplish this, but it would be good to have some sort of discussion that made the effort to kind of register our current state for other people who might be interested in joining at some point, getting a kind of minimally organized view of what we've been up to, what we've been doing. So I try to organize this, not, let's say, with straight focus on the stuff we've been talking about or the problems that are currently on the table, but imagining that or even like historically how you arrive at things, but just trying to give a sort of reconstruction of some of these ideas that might make sense for somebody who's coming kind of fresh into these problems and might be interested or not. I feel like I've tried to make contact with people recently, especially because of the primer, and I felt like sometimes there was a bit of a lack of kind of nice resources we could send people to clarify some ideas or show that this is very heterogeneous. There are many things happening. I think that even though we have good introductions, perhaps in the primer itself, it starts with an introduction, which I remember Reza said it was a good one. It's also quite quick, right? So I think this could be partially considered like a report on how I personally see where we've got this far. And I left a couple of empty slides at the end. I thought that hopefully if I'm not too slow with the presentation and depending on how things go, we could try to fill them in together with like, okay, this is where we think is missing, or this is not good, this requires more development and things like this. So also please stop me as I go, just so also I can include things you guys think is important. I think that is useful, is just didactically useful to imagine that someone else will see this afterwards. So if I'm going through stuff and you guys think you might understand it, but a third party might not, or the implicit stuff is clear to you, but you think it should be made more explicit, it's good to stop and add these things so that in the end we have something which is not just another record of one of our kind of overview meetings, but a record of kind of a semi-consistent presentation of this stuff that we can send other people if we like, right? So I start just with like these two statements that were made in the primer, and more than one person referred that they seemed like a good description of this sort of overarching framework. So I thought it was good to start from there. So in the primer, we are basically recapitulating something that we published as a collective text a couple of months ago, but we recapitulate these 2 points in a shorter form. So I'll just restate these things and start from there. So 2 general objectives of this research project, right? The first one is to construct a theoretical approach to emancipatory political thinking in which the distinction between political economy and political organization is no longer a substantial one, requiring 2 conceptual frameworks. So this means, on the one hand, that the tools employed in producing structural analysis of capitalist formations, amongst which we can include Marx's critique of political economy, should be also useful in equally structural analysis of leftist organizations and organizational networks. Inversely, it also entails developing the formal means to consider large economic social structures as particular organizational types. So even though you can call a capitalist economy something like a totality, just because you're calling it totality doesn't mean there's nothing else to talk about. It's still a particular totality, right? Thus allowing leftist categories of political action to find interesting counterparts in broader discussions of alternative social formations and large-scale dynamics. So this first objective could thus be summarized as the attempt to render the following statement meaningful. So one of the things we're trying to do, I think this is actually perhaps a bit more restricted to the primer. We could imagine this statement not being that general, but definitely this is a good evaluative measure for our objectives to make this meaningful, that economies are large organizations and collectives are small economies. And the word small and large here do a lot of heavy lifting, right? Because clearly economies and organizations are very, very, very different. So to say that they are kind of the same, as long as you consider something about their scale, complexity, and so on and so forth, is asking of the concept of scale, complexity, so on and so forth, to account for a lot of very qualitative difference, right? But that's one of the, I would say, one of the nice summaries of a goal of a research, to make that idea more clear, right? And the second objective complicates this picture even further. We aim at not only situating the duality between economy and organization within a common underlying framework, we also want this theoretical backdrop to support the investigation of more social structures and forms than we can already conceive today. So it's not only a matter of bridging this gap while kind of explaining why it exists, right? But also doing it in such a way that the result is not a description of everything, but it's, again, a particular description of a specific world where more stuff could happen, right? That is, such a framework should not only be broader than both political economy and political organization, but it should also allow us to express other forms of economic and collective organization still to be discovered and tested. Just as the first objective requires us to construct a scale-sensitive conceptual grammar, right? As we were talking about, this large and small makes a big difference. The second proposition requires this framework to have a practical and informative counterpart, which entails making the following statement also meaningful: that social organizations can be treated as political experiments. So not only are we bridging a certain gap, are we interested in seeing how economy, the large-scale economies, small-scale organizations can be seen as part of something in common, but we also want to see in which way new constructions can be informative of the space of what can be organized and what forms of economic life are possible. So it's not simply, if the first one has a very kind of transcendental point of view or very general theoretical point of view, the second actually requires it to be kind of, to have a hole in it where new information can come and change it from practical experiments, right? And this should be accounted for in this theory. This theory needs to learn something, be able to learn something, let's say. So with this in mind, I think that these are the four terms, right, that are introduced in these two objectives: political economy and political organization kind of separated in some way. Then you have this theoretical framework, which wants to bind them, but also in a way that allows for some experimental dimension to be anticipated and kind of to have a place for it, right? And I think that with these four terms, we can already describe something that I think is, let's say, more or less the status quo, perhaps, or more or less the place we're departing from, which is pretty much the dynamic between these four terms that I think we can broadly identify today. So in this little stupid drawing here, what you get is that, you start from this schism between organization and economy. And you can think of it in many ways. There are many names for this today, from the local versus the global, the fragmentary, subjectivized resistance versus the ossified structure, totality, concreteness versus abstraction, whatever you want, but there is some sort of intransitivity between these two things. It's impossible to connect them or to extract consequences from one to the other. Sorry, just bring Yasha into the meeting. Well, the solutions to these sort of problems appear usually by way of going up beyond politics itself, right? So you move to a certain ideological realm where this problem disappears. So for example, if you answer the question, what is politics? You answer it abstract. You know what the political is. You know what is at stake in every politics, because that's the transcendental metaphysical kernel of what it means to do politics. This issue kind of, it remains untouched, but you feel like you overcame it, right? By a very, very general theory. Because you have such a general theory which speaks about all human beings, about everything that organizes political life or something like this, you kind of take a detour and solve the problem by going up, right? Well, what this does is that, well, if you have a kind of general theory of everything here, which explains what is good politics, bad politics, what explains what is at stake in large-scale politics, what is not at stake in small-scale politics, so on. Well, there's nothing to learn. So this experimental dimension is pretty much effaced, right? That's why I divided this as if it's a strategy with three terms, right? The schism between political economy and organization is pretty much kept. It's not thematized as a problem. It is abstractly subsumed and resolved by a general theory. It doesn't need to be philosophical. I put it ideology here. I usually put philosophy, but I'm trying to be more diplomatic. And I feel like even if it doesn't need to be philosophical, it can be, for example, an ultra-political theory that takes a very particular political process and treats it as the key to understanding every political situation in the world, right? Again, you will keep this issue here of what you could learn from your local adventures in politics about the social structure and what new social structures might change in the way you politically organize. This is kept totally unaddressed. You generalize this new thing, and then there's also no need to learn anything new, right? So again, once you subsume this under theory of everything, there is no need for real political experimentation to learn about what is possible. You can simply kind of deduce it from the stuff you already know, right? So I think that if we go back to those two objectives, this is pretty much the strategy we're trying to work with, right? The schism between, sorry, just change color here. Yeah, fuck it. Now Raquel is joining. So the schism between political economy and organization, it's not overcome. It's not like we want to treat everything as the same. Clearly, there are differences here which are relevant, right? But you see, if you compare with the previous arrow, which went simply up, here the arrow goes down. We want a framework which is capable of deriving why this looks one way and this looks another way. And if you have that common framework, through it, you can also imagine these things moving from here to here as well, right? So the schism between political economy and organization becomes derivable. So it is itself thematized. You can talk about it. You can talk about why it appears in some places, not in others. It becomes an important theme for politics and for political thinking, right? This framework is not only concerned with dealing with these two things at once, but it's also trying not to be a theory of everything. That's why it's moving from this general kind of idealized description of the social world to something that is more intimate or closer or more constrained to the matters at hand, right? And precisely because it is constrained, it also requires to learn new things, right? So it's constrained to political matters in such a way to remain susceptible to political experimentation, which will affect both these things. So you get kind of a virtuous circuit here. So I hope that the difference between these two things is kind of clear, right? To overcome this problem by going to a general theory where it doesn't exist, because there is no, everything is already kind of visible from there. So you, at the same time that you avoid this, thematizing this problem, you also lose the experimental dimension. Whereas here, you try to remain closer to political matters at the same time that you try to thematize why these things appear differently, and you are required to have space to learn new things, because this is becomes a historicized framework in a way.
One question that I have, Gabriel, is what is the impetus in page number 6 for, or maybe I misread the diagram. The schism that you show between political economy and political organization, is this a schism? Is this the structure of this schism, or the reason of this schism is because one tries to provide a mapping directly from political economy to political organization, or vice versa?
What I'm calling a schism is simply the fact that today we have pretty much concepts to deal with this: resistance, struggle, solidarity, group formation, enemy, all those things. And we have a different set of concepts to deal with political economy: social relations, social form, fetishism, different dynamics of economic categories, and so on and so forth. And there is, it's hard to say if you make a statement here, if it can have a consequence for a statement here, or vice versa. They are unrelated in a way, right?
Correct. But the reason I'm saying this, that the structure of the solution in page 7, if you remove the line between political and economy and political organization, the structure of the solution is the same, except
yeah, you can imagine that line is still here, right? In a way, I mean, these things are still not the same, right?
Yeah, but my question was that, as a matter of fact, that you need that line for page 6. Whereas you're saying that that line is an imaginary line. It's because it's imaginary line, and it tries to find, for the sake, because it is imaginary.
What do you mean imaginary? This line here?
Yeah.
Why is it imaginary?
Imaginary in terms of the line does not really exist. The only way that it exists is by virtue of having the mapping in a framework. Or are you intending, so let me ask this question, are you intending in page 7 to maintain a line between political economy and political organization?
No, let's be very concrete. Let's say the fact that the price of rice in China affects the derivative market in the States, and this has a consequence for housing in the south of the United States. Okay, this is a certain construction in very large scale social phenomenon, right? You construct it with some concepts. To organize homeless people against Wall Street is something that organizers do here with different concepts, right? To the point that when you mention these ideas here, they are pretty much indistinct in a certain way, because there's no way of evaluating that or knowing anything. It's kind of like talking about reptilians and, aliens robbed you of your house. Like, okay, in practice, what's the difference? There is a big difference between this kind of conceptual space and this conceptual space. This exists because these phenomena are different. There is a real qualitative difference between, I don't know, a worldwide crisis and a more smaller scale attempt to organize the, tenants in a neighborhood. But one thing is to keep that distinction as if it was, this qualitative distinction means it's a substantive distinction, because one thing is called structural flow of commodities because capital is an always evolving form and all the sort of way we talk about this. And the other here is about humanity and solidarity and people are together, which is a totally different kind of world picture, right? So the phenomena are different because they are really different. But do you need to start from that difference and talk about it in such separate ways? Or is it possible to have some framework which explains, right, which accounts for why this is so different from that? These two things still remain different. But rather than simply letting that be, there is interesting, important information about why they are different. And you can do things about that difference. I'm not sure if that helps. Like, I'm not saying it's imaginary. I would distinguish it in terms of, is it a problem of any political area to deal with this? Or is it just a fact of life and just let it be, right? My suggestion is that in the first case, this schism is just kept as is. You overcome it simply by being more abstract. You overcome it simply by going to a point of view where it doesn't exist. Let's talk about, radical subjectivity and how it appears out of people's inner creativity. Well, one person, 1,000 people, infinite people, you can talk about it all in the same way. You're so far away from reality that changes in scale don't matter. You're outside of the world, right? So this is the space where a lot of political philosophy happens. So it's just the solution. This is a detour to deal with this, right? Whereas in this case, this wouldn't be a detour. You're avoiding being that general. You're trying to stay closer to real politics, but inside your framework for dealing with political strategy, political life, different conjunctures, so on, you want to be able to address both of these sides. I'm not sure if that clarifies.
Okay, let's continue. I think I'll think about this a little bit more. Maybe
hopefully, I try to address it a bit better later on. I added 7. The presentation is divided into 7 bits, which I think cover pretty much a lot of the kind of related areas of discussion that just those 2 objectives require. If you want to deal with those 2 objectives, you need to deal with at least the 7 different researches. First of all, you need to be able to say what's wrong with political economy. Why isn't Marxist critique of political economy good as it is? So how do you need to diagnose impasses and problems in the current critiques of political economy? Otherwise, there is no reason to do any of this. Second, you need to diagnose impasses and problems in the framework for organizing, because if they're great, there's also no need, right? So what is wrong with these things as they exist today? So after we address these 2 things, the third point is, well, is there an account of political economy, of economic dynamics, of social formation, so on, which is closer to this, right? Which is, it might not deal with political organization, but it's already more inviting. right? It's an arrow going this way, but aware that you want an arrow going that way as well. So it's already more flexible to include this. Then the fourth point is there a description of political organization, engagement, and so on, which also has the same flexibility? It also is affected by what's going on here. So you can talk about social formation, economic dynamics, so on and so forth. And what you say here affects what you say here and vice versa. So, but that's not enough, because there is a lot of work, and I think a lot of our efforts have gone in this arrow here, which is how do you criticize this general kind of political ideology, the sort of spontaneous philosophy of political thinking, and find, so how do we do a sort of philosophical and political critique of these ideological generalizations? How do we distinguish improper and proper connections between this framework and other fields, so we can use other fields and can learn things from other areas? But how do you do this without generalizing it to the point that we go back to that previous schema, right? Where solutions and the content of the theory just comes from science, for example. So on the one hand, you want to move away from this towards this more intimate relation with politics. But on the other hand, you're also borrowing from many fields in order to do this, right? But then that's not enough, because if you construct something like this, well, you have this arrow here and these two arrows here, meaning it needs to have a method for us to learn from real world political processes and their problems, right? So whatever happens in reality must, under certain conditions, affect how we understand political economy and how we understand political organization. And we need to have some conception of how political practices might mobilize this new tool, right? So diagnosing the impasses on both sides, reconstructing political economy in a framework that is already more connected with political organization, but doing the same thing on the other side, finding good resources from other fields to give some flesh to this framework, but also keep it intimate enough with politics and the historical conditions of politics today, so that we can learn from real world processes, they affect the way that they affect these things here, right? And that has some comes together with some way of this being integrated into political thinking. It's not like something happening outside that has no practical bearing, but can actually enter into a conversation with how people do politics today. So those are the 7 points that I thought we could try to cover today, like just giving a report on at least how my personal perspective is on where we've gotten with these 7 things. So how far we got with them, right? Does this make sense this far?
Yep. So these 7 points.
I think so.
Go ahead, Yasha.
I was just gonna ask where the, I guess, idea. Sorry, I missed the first few minutes of political framework fits in between organization and ideology.
Yeah, it's a good. I have no idea how it fits between this and this.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a better understanding of what you mean by framework exactly here.
Yeah, I think it's something between theory, between, you know, a bunch of good tools to do things. I didn't really know how to call this. I think let me give a concrete example of why I think what is a different why this is a good thing to call a framework rather than, for example, a full-fledged theory. You want to be able to, for example, under certain conditions, you're organizing, but you don't know why. You cannot explain the world you're organizing, and that happens 99% of the time. So once this question, in other words, let me just go back to this simplified thing here, the most simple one, right? So what you want is, let's say there is a big divide between the structural conditions under which we're working and what we can know locally as a group of people, right? So let's say a question arises as to, what do we need to know in order to make some decisions or to move further, or if it's okay to do this or do that, right? Since we don't really have direct access to this, to the totality of the structures that determine the relevant structures that determine the political space, you might be tempted to go to some general theory here, which can give you an answer. Yeah, well, the bourgeois is bad, therefore you shouldn't be selling lemonade to pay for the protest banners. I don't know, something like that, right? It's a kind of general principled statement of what you should or shouldn't do, right? And it's actually pretending to derive it from this analysis. Well, but there is an alternative, which is to have some theoretical framework which allows you to say, yeah, you won't have all the answers, right? So you could address this you could look at it differently and say, okay, I don't know, but I might find out. And this might say something about the world I'm in.
I see. So it's like something that can factor through both political economy and organization.
Yeah,
to get to the experimental dimension, it takes both into account.
Yeah, so but you see the difference, right? The first, a question arose here. You can't really access this to know where you are and get an answer. Because you can't, you actually go this way to a general theory, right? Which just tells you the answer. And in this second case,
this is like a
this is blocked.
The parallax thing, right?
Yeah, it's that. I think it's very much connected.
Yeah. Same idea.
Yeah, I'll try to go into that right now, in fact, because. But I just wanted to make sure that this doesn't sound like. I mean, this is totally crazy, but that it sounds the right sort of crazy. It's crazy, but it has a very, very kind of concrete kind of underlying problem, right?
I have a question.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just because I can't see the diagram, but I'm imagining it right now. And
do you want me to send you the PDF? I don't know if you can open it on your phone.
Yeah. If you could send it through WhatsApp, I can look at it. But I was thinking of two very concrete examples, and I think we can distinguish our framework from these two examples, and I think it would make it clearer for us, because right now the state seems to provide an interface between organization, like local organizations, and this bigger space of political economic dynamics. And those two, there are two forms at least. One is the company, right? The business, which is a legal entity that can interface with capital, basically, like interface with the world of commodities. And then there's also, I would say on a different level, there's like political parties, right? Political parties are another form that can kind of have this legal status that in both cases, the state gives this level of this interface that I think kind of bridges these two things, but not in a way that's very rich for different forms of organizing, right?
I totally,
that's why,
yeah, that's a really good idea. Let me add this here. Sorry.
Yeah. So the problem that you raised, one concrete thing that we have no answer for is, for example, you're trying to start something new, like a different, let's say, non-capitalist form of organizing. And then a question comes up like, how much should you align yourself with, let's say, a given political party in your area, right? Because they have the existence, the legal existence, and the kind of, you know, the weight of political force or whatever in the current world. So it does seem like, you know, a lot of organizations, when they get big enough, they need to somehow decide, like, should we, you know, support a political candidate, for example. But you still want to maintain, you don't want to be completely absorbed into that form that the state has created, right? The political party form. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where our framework is kind of different, right? We want to somehow acknowledge that there is this form required to bridge the gap between local organizations and then this global political economic space. But we don't want to be subsumed into what the state currently provides as a form.
Yeah, I think it's a good. It's very sad that you can see this, since I'm just trying to write down what you said. But by the way, I sent you the PDF on WhatsApp. Yeah, but I think you raised the perfect point. I kind of summarize it in a way that I think it could be better done, which is, if you assume that there is some mismeasure or some opaqueness between situated organizations, militants, and so on the one side, right? And social structure at large, includes economy and so on. Then there are certain available mediators, right? So the state is a mediator. It can give off information that can tell you how to act on your share of the world, right? Companies can also do so. Why not? For or against. You can also go against a company, and that's your measure of what you're doing. Political parties can function in this sort of mediating role. And what I try to add, which is why I called it ideology, because I think that for the theoretical point of view, this is what, let's say, is in our way. It's just the ideologues, right? And it's not a word we use very much these days, but it's just this sort of sophistry, which implies that, and it's funny because the classic sophistry supposedly went to a more fragmentary point of view to kind of get in the way of you understanding the totality. But you can get the opposite type of sophistry, which is such a general absolute theory, which also offers to mediate and get in the way of you learning something. So you can have a sort of philosophical or a sort of abstracting mediation, not only, let's say, through institutions, right? You can have theory itself being this mediator, which is, again, saying you don't need to experiment something here to learn. You don't need the experiment because you can learn straight from the source, so to speak, right? So it's not about removing mediators, but what the point is, how do you add something else, which we call this sort of political framework here, which is also mediating, but rather than substituting the sort of more situated way of extracting information, it's actually giving you tools to do so, right?
I have a question, but if I'm not interrupting or
no problem.
Your train of thought, I think it was on the. I opened up the PDF. It was on the, I think, 8 or 7 page. Can you please?
This one.
Yeah, that one. I have a question, and it's mainly probably due to my being ignorant of the whole framework, but I have I'm a bit confused with the arrows. because one time you went and you did the route, and you went from political organization to political framework, then down to experimental dimension and into political economy. And I was wondering if it's a necessary way.
Yeah, like this, right?
Yeah, if it's necessary to do that sort of whatever, or if you can go straight. Because if you can go straight, it seems like what you're calling a political framework is it's mainly a translation, a model for translation, something that maintains itself theoretical enough to be indifferent to both worlds, but still not enough. It's not, how do I say this? It isn't caught up with itself too much. It doesn't turn into theory.
Yeah.
I think that's, if I understand what you're talking about when you're saying the difference between ideology and political framework, is because it doesn't concern itself with itself too much.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, because, for example, we gave the example of coming up with a question politically, and how do you, let's say, deal with the fact that there is no general answer, right? You cannot do this, and then instead experiment and learn something. But that's not the only way. Sometimes you know things, right? I mean, and in fact, we know a lot of stuff. So how do you translate stuff that you already know into a way of talking about it that is actually useful for political practice, or vice versa? That might not require it. It might be, I think, more like what you're saying, as if the movement is just going here, right? More like translating. I don't think these arrows mean that much. Like, I mean, there's way too many arrows on this page anyway. So no, I wouldn't like get too stuck on it. Also, because I think that this is just to introduce, let's say, I think we should just take from this that there are many tasks just to maintain that freaking objectives, right? It's just to show, like, yeah, if you want to go this route, you need to do a lot of stuff at the same time, right? But I don't think that it says very much about the end result, how things relate, how you would name things. I think this is really just to try to introduce the problem, right? But I do think that this, sorry?
It seems that the most crucial aspect is to find a unitary framework. So it's less about the framework and more about the unitary. Because even if you take political parties or companies, like, you don't need to have a economic theory to write about how business should work, or you don't have to have a full state theory to be a political militant in the parliament and things like this. And I think that the effort here is to have this theoretical framework that solves both sides. Like, the more structural, it has like concepts and notions that enable you to understand what is going on in the like deep social level, but at the same time address like concrete social, like concrete practices, local practices, like a theory, like a political theory, like a political theory of the state that has concepts like the people, but also like adversaries in a political conflict. So like, I think that this is it's a unitary level.
Yeah, I think that if you plane. Yeah, I think that the strong word, that's why I think framework is more important than theory. Like, it might be the case that when you achieve something like this, what is a meaningful statement in this framework it's not that theory laden. It might be something like, for example, a meaningful statement we already know that this theory wants to uphold is, dude, you don't know. Like, should we do this or that? What does the Lenin oracle tell us? I don't know. Like, that should be a meaningful statement. It's not a theoretical statement in the sense that it's explaining causes and effects and clarifying the world. On the contrary, right? It's just saying that lack of intelligibility is rational.
Mm-hmm. So I think a very important. Sorry, finish your statement.
No, please.
I think a very important statement here is that political framework does not foreclose access to experimental dimension, whereas ideology does.
Yeah.
So the experimental dimension remains a pathway for the political framework in order to develop abstractions or tools otherwise directly from the experimental dimension. Whereas the difference ideology is instead of getting those abstractions from experimental dimension, they are trying to abstract the concepts directly from political economy and political organization to a higher level genre that would contain both of them.
Yeah,
so I think that is
exactly
that is the structural difference between political framework and ideology.
Yeah,
where their abstractions are coming from.
Exactly, I think so too. I think that it's where the abstractions come from, and the fact, I mean, if you take these arrows here, right, they all point the same direction, kind of. This is unconstrained, right? This is what everything points to, and then it constrains this. You don't need this. Whereas in the other case, it's very tense, because on the one hand, these things are changing all the time, right? And you need to be, this is kind of, these three arrows for me mean something like as close as possible to. So if in reality you don't have knowledge, the proper statement you want to make is we don't know. Not substitute this we don't know for well, but according to human nature, we know this, right? So I think it goes exactly with what you were saying, this idea of it's a framework where it might be theoretically poorer than what you could more generally say, but it's theoretically poorer, but better placed, right? As you said, it's better placed at least to consider abstractions coming from, to being formed by other things, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's also good to emphasize that this experimental dimension is not like purely a scientific one, right?
Yeah,
I think that's something that comes out of this like parallax relationship between political economy and organization, that there's going to be like contradictions that come into play from there. I think this is also the reason why we're interested in all these like weird logic stuff, right? Because we already have the intuition that like the predicates at play here don't follow like classical logic rules.
Yeah, and I think that this is crucial, because I think you should read this arrow here, right? This third arrow with the second, because if this second arrow didn't exist, so if you could just make these general statements from a very strong kind of general philosophy point of view, then this thing here would, the meaning of experimental would also be very general. But because you're first trying to be as close as possible to what is politically rational, then what this means will also be as close as possible to what is politically relevant in terms of experiments. So this is a big question. And I would say that this is one of the biggest questions, in my opinion. How would we define in a strictly or very intimately political way what we are calling experimental here? Because definitely there's a lot of inspiration coming from the field that has the most fully fledged theory of experimentation, but that's not what we mean, and it's not science. And I think that here, for example, we actually had the good luck of being informed from very early on by the fact that experimentation is actually quite equivocal in its meaning. There is artistic experimentation, and I mean, Caron always brought concerns coming from the static level. Psychoanalysis is concerned with the experimentation in other fields, more subjective, libidinal, or whatever. We are also interested in scientific experimentation, so it's hard to simply have, again, a theory of everything that explains what historically specific experimentation politics would be. So I think we're kind of covered in not simply borrowing metaphors from science and solving it that way, right? But just so we can move on, I hope some of these ideas also become a bit clearer as we go. I tried again, very personal. I think if you guys have other ideas, I can add them to the slides. But I try to define kind of a couple of diagnoses on impasses in the critique of political economy today and impasses in problems in organizing today, right? So what's wrong with the current approach, the critique of political economy? Let's use this instead of the. So I think that a good kind of a very direct, I mean, actually we have a very contemporary example of this. A couple of days ago, a very famous value theorist just gave Anselm Yappe just gave a lecture together with some other theorists, and he just made a fool of himself, kind of, with the way that he derived political kind of positions out of the very radical Kurtian value theory that he espouses. And there was an interesting debate online, not really a debate, just many rants compiled together about how value theories make for poor political strategists, and how usually they downplay the importance of any concrete political struggle, but not really taking the anecdotal, so focusing on it. For example, you find Zizek has this good analysis somewhere about this sort of parallax between value theory and class struggle in Marxist politics. By parallax, it just means that it seems like if you give the proper, not too little, or not exaggerated, but if you give the proper kind of emphasis on value theory, on the fact that it's not just an economic description, it also has broad social consequences, that it describes something like the sociality in a fully fetishized class society in late capitalism. So if you fully expand the possibilities of value theory in Marxism, it leads you to downplay class struggle, workers' movement, to conceive the worker as pretty much part of the capitalist process and so on. Whereas if you give the proper value to class struggle and political struggle and so on, therefore focusing on strategy, mobilization, agency, so on, you tend to devalue this more structural kind of socially transcendental point of view, which is equally valid. So it seems like you need to choose which of the two you emphasize, even though that choice is not an overemphasis, it's not an exaggeration. It's just that when you find the proper position to talk about value, from that perspective, some things disappear from the horizon. Whereas when you take the proper political, conjunctural, strategic point of view, some categories disappear from your radar as well. So Zizek calls this a parallax, following Karatani, right? But I mean, you could argue that, I mean, for all the amazing efforts you can find, there is historically a difficulty integrating into a dialogue with Marxist critique of political economy, theoretical frameworks that come from other fronts of struggle. So even though in one level, we are committed when we describe categories like value, money, things like this, we're committed to the idea that we're describing a sort of underlying structural logic of the social space in capitalism. It's weirdly complicated to embed into it other frames of analysis, which we ourselves claim to be more restricted than ours. So it's different. For example, if somebody comes with anti-colonialist description of slavery and its relations to contemporary capitalism, you can claim that that's a more restricted view. You're focusing on some phenomena, you're not focusing on the bigger picture, whatever. You could argue something like this. But if you do, it seems like the consequence is that the two things should be compatible, with one being the richer framework under which the other falls. But usually that's not what happens. What you do is that you first claim you have the more general framework, and then you claim the other framework doesn't fit. But those are contradictory statements. If it's the most general framework, the other framework should fit, right? So it's very weird mixture between saying you already have the better description of the same phenomena. You want to understand critical questions in climate change, Anthropocene. Well, we have a really good theory of this. We can really see how these things relate when you consider forces of production and land or whatever. Well, but if that's the case, in some level, you should be able to accommodate the poorer theory, right? Or to at least save something of it. But what you usually get is actually a sort of critique that those frameworks have nothing to add. It's not simply that they are translatable, it's that they are illegitimate, right? So, of course, there are many developments, but my impression is that they are generally a bit kind of Ptolemaic, in the sense that at best you make a small increment to what you already knew. Nothing fundamental is changed by any of the novelties. So critical ecology, social reproduction theory, critical race theory, generally they don't get to add anything structural to how you think about political economy and the critique of these categories. They are usually, let's say, accidental addendums, right? I add here the peripherization theory, which is not really such a clearly developed one, but from these ones, I think it's actually one which helps see, like it kind of summarizes in a way the other ones. But this idea that there is something about the vector of historical development that historically inverted or revealed itself to not be what we imagined, the basic idea that centrally developed capitalist societies, advanced capitalist formations, they tend to expand towards the periphery, and of course, in a dialectical way, depend on the peripheries, forming a sort of parasitizing cancer formation around them, but still they have the, let's say, the place where the logic appears in its purer form, to a situation where it's the inverse. And the hybrid status of peripheral formations in capitalism, they give the pure form of what's going to happen, or if it's not already happening, to advanced capitalist formations, which are starting to lose their momentum, right? So again, that's a theory that doesn't have small things to say, accidental addendums to make. If historically it is possible that those vectors of expansion should invert or reveal themselves not to be how we thought, that says something about the history of capitalism as a whole, and not just kind of addendum you can just put as a footnote or something like this, right? Again, I'm being very superficial here, guys, so please, if you have other things you'd like to add, let me know. Another thing I think is relevant, though I don't think it's framed in the best way, but is a sort of primary reliance. And my problem is not that it relies, but it primarily relies on philosophy rather than politics to justify itself many times. So if you ask, for example, on a social network, just to get the worst possible version of the answer, like if you ask around, like, why Marx starts with value, or why categories are derived the way they are, or how should you make decisions about what to accept and what not to accept in these other frameworks that are trying to map out important tensions in social world today? Most of the answers come through a sort of philosophical commitment. But that's not Hegelian, for example, or Marx was committed to this and that and so on, or through some philosophy of science, because Althusser said that Bachelard said, or something, rather than having any measure of political consequences being good enough kind of criteria to evaluate, should we add this, should we not add this, is this worth changing or not worth changing, or something like this. I think that this is not a good formulation, because clearly what I'm calling philosophical base is just the fact that there is some very broad, theoretical, immutable principle that is allowed to do the mediating kind of decisions as to, do we bring this from science or not? Do we bring this from, you know, do we go back and reread Marx for the 100th time to now understand truly that everything was there already, right? It's more exegetical, perhaps. But then this is, of course, not everything. The critique of political economy is also filled with sort of internal challenges that create this sort of huge spectrum of different interpretations where no one agrees with no one, and kind of just reinforces something which we will see in a bit again, which is the sort of the paradox that contradictions inside Marxism are more visible than contradictions between Marxism and the rest of the world. So the contradictions in readings of Marx are more visible than the contradictions between Marx and actual social structure, right? So just to kind of name the usual suspects of sort of challenges to Marxist interpretation of political economy, you have the whole debate on what is value, what is the status of value, and what is the status of abstract labor, and then you get like 10 interpretations of, is abstract labor a mental abstraction? What does real abstraction mean? Is labor a historical category and not historical category, and so on and so forth. You have the related argument that we live under a crisis of the measure of value, because labor is no longer used in such quantities in such way that labor time can serve as a measure for magnitudes of value. Therefore, value is unhinged from its determinant. It can be susceptible to changes in erratic, chaotic ways, or that therefore the theory is no longer valid, and things like this. You have more, for the nerds, you have the transformation problem, which is a 100-year-long debate on, well, Marx introduces the concept of value in one book, but then he introduces a new concept of price in the third book, and these things don't match. How should you systematize his theory of capitalist dynamic to explain why prices are the output of a certain dynamic, but values are the input, and so on? And there's a big debate there as well, which I think goes through some other very profound issues, but just to be very vulgar in the summary. The whole issue with the tendency of the profit rate to fall, is there an inherent limit to capital? Is there no inherent limit? Is it fully capable of absorbing anything that comes in its way and self-reproducing or not? It's again a big point of debate. This is I added this here just for romantic reasons, but at once in the past, there was something called the transition problem that nobody else talks about, which is how do you pass from a capitalist society to a socialist society and then to a communist society? But again, it was a big debate. What does this mean? How should this be done? And from these problems, in a certain way, it was the problem that kind of brings all of these together. Because it also had that kind of nice flavor of being a strategic problem in some level, right? What institutions need to be dismantled, and what sort of provisory structures of power should be in place so that certain fundamental things can change. How do we measure if they changed? What should we consider as a acceptable form of kind of dictatorship of the proletariat, as they used to call it, and so on, right? So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to this, but I just wanted to point out with these points here that there is something of that schism we were talking about, right? There is something about expansion and revision that is problematic. That there is some sort of ideological backdrop which we bring up every time something doesn't really seem like we can decide based on the conjecture and novel informations, right? And this sort of inner impasses, which show that there is also more stuff to know. It's not, everything is not settled. There are some aspects of, for example, reading Capital that are quite clear and quite well described, but there are other stuff that everyone is debating for 200 God knows how many years, and we're not really clear on how to deal with it. So there's definitely open problems, right?
I had two things I wanted
go ahead.
to just toss in real quick. I think the transition problem and its disappearance is interesting in terms of our theory, because a lot of the reasons it disappeared was like the experimental space of the new economic policies and everything that came. That was the experimental terrain to where that like conversation a lot of times like was actually interesting. And as that kind of withered up, there was no real basis, at least for an interesting conversation about transition. It became more abstract.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to add that kind of, I think, connects bullet points 2 and 3 is just that like in the States, and I think it's the same for a lot of places with a very militant right wing, things like critical race theory and social reproduction theory and its link to theories of gender are what are most under attack by the right wing. Like they're not, they use Marxism as like a bogey monster, but they're not attacking Marxist theory. They're attacking critical race theory and gender theory. And so I think that indicates like, that just requires us another level to think about. Like, why is that the main focal point and not others? What do we do as Marxists in response to that, both politically and theoretically?
Yeah. Adding on to that, a lot of them think that Marxism is the basis of those as well. That's like how they frame it.
Yeah, I love that our political enemies are always more optimistic about what's going on than reality, right? Because
exactly,
they think we already integrated all those things into some sort of, you know, translatable framework, as we were talking about. But in reality, there is no such thing, and we're all lost. Which is in itself something I think I could have added to the next point, but I didn't. But I think this should be added here somewhere. Let me just go over the points that I added for, again, to make us even more depressed. What's wrong with our current approach to collective organization? This is already wrong. My title is wrong because, of course, there is no one approach, right? There are many approaches. And some work much better than others. It's the field where you're bound to be very unjust when you try to talk about it, because political organization is definitely much richer than critique of political economy in terms of the amount of little practical kind of ways of looking at politics that have been developed throughout the world. And you have, I mean, I would say that the critique of political economy might be the heritage of like 300 years, but the collection or the treasure of ideas for political organization is like the history of many thousand years, if you want. So, and across the globe, and it's very porous, it's very different, So you're bound to be unjust when you say that there is a problem, because there's probably somebody in some group for which this is not a problem. And I've been revising a lot of my universal statements about issues in politics and the left after I've started getting into contact with these guys called Seco Cezola. I'm pretty much convinced they have everything figured out. So so there might be no problem with political organization, but assuming that there is, and that, I mean, we can still go in this direction and ask certain questions, right? I think that the whole point is that even though there are many approaches, right, and you can find this dense heterogeneity of methods and ways of approaching organization strategy and so on, there are some unacknowledged common challenges. And I think as we go along, it will become clear why these common challenges are not simply something accidental to remark in passing, but for communists, they should be probably the biggest focus. At least it's a defensible position that communists today, interested in what Marx called the movement as a whole, will only see that whole by looking at common challenges rather than looking at common statements, right? So taking from the experience of the circle, but also, for example, from our reading of Aurora Apolito's the problem of scale in anarchism and cyber communism, right? I think, to put it very bluntly, very simply, we can kind of remark that there are at least 3 very big issues that appear across very different and heterogeneous forms of organization, right? So the problem of growth, how do you grow as an organization? What sort of challenge that the intrinsic problem of growing produces? It's not coming necessarily from your external adversary or political forces. It's coming from, let's say, the weight of the growth itself, right? They call it a scalar problem, but I think, just to be a bit simpler, we can call it just the growth of the organization. Problems of complexity, because organizations don't simply grow and become more of the same. Weird phenomena appear as these become more complex. It becomes irreducible to, let's say, an organization based on certain principles can become irreducible to those principles out of its own dynamic, not because somebody kind of took it out of its way, deviated in an opportunistic or authoritarian way, but simply due to this weight, right, of growth. If something grows too much, it can acquire certain properties that emerge there that were not there before, that make it harder to sustain the principles that founded the organization, right? And a third thing that I think is irreducible to those other 2 problems, which is connectivity, which is how do different organizations relate amongst each other, share information, share history, support each other, or kind of form a larger organism rather than those single organizations on their own, right? So those are, let's say, types of problems which we could call something like intrinsic problems. Even if the right didn't exist, if there were just some leftists in an island with resources and time, growth problems, complexity problems, and connectivity problems could emerge anyway, right? Plus a lot of other problems. But anyway, the second thing that I added here is an unacknowledged common challenge, which I think is perhaps not very well framed in this way, which is that internal tension within the left tends to be more visible than its external effectivity. And I would add something that I didn't put here, which I think is also something relevant and that kind of appears across the board, which is that generally you only measure effectivity and let's say you only get to know what happens in terms of growth, complexity, and connectivity and strategy and so on by an evaluation of your adversary. So, for example, to go back to a problem we were talking about before, for example, if the right wing in America thinks that cultural Marxism is kind of spawning gender theory, critical race theory, and so on and so forth, that fantasy that we are already unified substitutes and kind of fascinates to the point that you don't need to actually do the work of unification because in some phantasmatic level that already exists, right? So there is this kind of weird measure of our existence by the resistance of the other, which I think it's something nice that Marcuse once wrote about a sort of symptom of what he called, let me just see if I can add this here, counter revolution without revolution, right? This idea that you can have a right wing kind of status quo so excited and mobilized that very small things produced by the left get very big reactions, and you measure yourself by those big reactions to assume that you're actually at that level of political effectivity, right?
Yeah, I think that's been the status quo in the United States for a while.
Yeah, and I would say it's not only the United States.
Probably Brazil now too. Yeah.
Yeah, we've It's been that way at least since 1964.
Mm-hmm.
The coup in Brazil was justified in terms of the communist menace, right? Which we were nowhere near. But anyway, so I think another kind of set of problems that are, again, are kind of common challenges, but these ones they're not really intrinsic, or they don't appear in this particular way, which we can call just problems that emerge from continuing to do things in the way that we used to when the ground changed or is no longer there, right? So new social contemporary, actually there's two social here, just try to emphasize how social this all is. So new contemporary social conditions. I added a bunch of terrible situations here just to contemplate how different the very meaning of organization might become in a kind of contemporary scenario. So for example, new situations of how do you call this, like work journey, and the new divisions of what is work time, rest time, leisure time, if you guys remember what that means from the distant past. Those affect the relation between time for militancy and activism and time for work, and how these things become kind of mixed together at the same time. One thing constrains the other, right? I think that social reproduction theory in Italy in the 70s made a very clear case for what this meant, because the moment that this doesn't simply appear in the sense of, well, we need to fight some new law that is changing our conditions of labor, but the fact that the changes in the condition of labor affect the condition for activism. So the poorer people became, the more they relied on a common kind of communitarian structure, which was pretty much something that was left to the women. Therefore, the women couldn't join political meetings, and only the men went. So the gender divide became much clearer in politics, precisely because of the way that unpaid housework became much more emphasized and needed in a time of social economic crisis, right? So on the one hand, you want to increase militancy in the time of social crisis, economic crisis. On the other hand, the crisis itself will kind of filter, because of its own economic structures, who gets to do activism and organize and who doesn't, right? Or changes that scenario. What I call social dehomogenization, or it's a thesis that a guy called Oscar Negt developed, but you find it in Brazil and other places, this idea that there is an increased break in a sort of underlying basic public sphere, which makes it so that the discourses and ways that you organize your kind of life world become more and more atomized, don't really cover the social space of your neighborhood, your city. So you get a sort of fractured social space where things don't get to transit or circulate in a sort of common public sphere and acquire more power, acquire more kind of social effectivity. The social space is kind of fractured due to underlying economic problems as well. The crisis in cognitive mapping, which we kind of addressed already, this idea that the more complex the world becomes, the harder it also is to map the causes and effects behind structures that intervene in daily life. And this sort of obscure or intransitive gap between immediate social experience and kind of transcendental social structure affects your capacity to map and situate yourself in this bigger picture, right? Then the crisis in, I call this crisis. Sorry, yeah.
Quick question: Would you tie the crisis in cognitive mapping to like capitalist realism? Seems like a similar.
Yeah, I think that the capitalist realism is a conjunction of these two theses here, because it treats kind of the end of the future as our inability to imagine, right? Personally, I don't like it very much, but I think it's cool. But I mean, it's useful in some sense. But I think you can derive a stronger thesis from this other two, because as we were talking about, this difficulty of mapping is not imaginary. It's real. A very, very complex world where a lot of things are integrated becomes a world where it's very hard to come up with, let's say, small mental schemes that give you the big picture, right? So the big picture gets kind of obscured, not because somebody told you not to dream, right? But because something really changed. So there is
it's the world itself, not just what's possible, right?
Yeah, it's not just that we were told by the hegemonic discourse not to dream of better futures, but actually that even if you tell somebody about a better future, it just looks far-fetched, like a fictional narrative, because nobody knows how to latch it back onto social reality, right? And so just to conclude, to show how we could arrive at the capitalist realism theory, this crisis of futurity, I didn't use the crisis of the future because definitely the future is there, but that Bifo Berardi guy, Franco Bifo Berardi, I think he coined a good term with this, which is not so much the future as the forward arrow in time, future, present, past, but futurity as a sense of you can turn this into a place that you can use, right? So you refer to the future, and that has effectivity. For example, when I tell you something like, I'll pay you tomorrow, it's not about what will happen tomorrow, it's about what you're gonna do for me today, right? You're gonna give me some money now. So the crisis of futurity is not about what waits us in the future, it's about the connection between whatever, it's about how the future is a place for us to use in the present. As a sort of kind of mediating temporal term. So for example, it's very hard to extract sacrifice or to solve conflicts or to postpone conflicts between, for example, different political fronts if you can't count on a future point which you say, well, when that point comes, we will solve this problem, but therefore we can live it for now. If there is no futurity, so if that future point is not an effective point you can count on, you cannot let that problem go right now, right? It's like a credit system in that sense, like, I'll give you credit, I don't agree with you, but we'll work this out once the revolution happens, right? Well, if there is nothing in the future in terms of revolution, then there is no future time when we will sort it out. We need to sort it out now. So there is this sort of emptying out that the future has something unknown, that you can risk things in the present because of it. And at the same, so this could be the temporal crisis, right? And the cognitive mapping could be the spatial crisis. The world is too big for me to navigate it and kind of mediate my immediate behavior based on the totality. And I can also not mediate my immediate behavior based on the future. So if you combine the two and you make it a bit more grungy and emo, you get Mark Fisher. But it can look much worse than that, I think.
Gabriel?
Yeah.
You mentioned under like the intrinsic problems that a lot of times I thought of like Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed, that like the concept of betrayal ends up kind of coming to explain these quote deviations, right? Or some kind of like failure to be authentic to the revolution, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's for me, that's a classic problem, but I'm not sure how common it is or how specific to a specific Marxist trend it is, that in deadlocks here, right, usually are
it was more
retroactively
just,
explained in terms of somebody betrayed, right, morally explained, right?
Yeah, because I think like well beyond any Marxist trend, just in general, at least, you know, being an organizer in the States, so not going beyond that, like the idea of, oh, we failed because of some party's betrayal is very common. So it seems like that kind of logic in and of itself is a major part of the issue in the left right now. And I don't know how much it should just be seen as a derivation from a failure to think versus kind of like a problem in and of itself. Is
Yeah, I was also commenting on that because it also seems that it's maybe a meta problem or like a problem at the level of the framework of normally you have these sorts of gaps in the approaches to political organization where different approaches, say, you know, like electoral politics, will see maybe revolutionary, like insurrectionalist politics as irresponsible, and vice versa. The other ones will see them as reformists. So there's all sorts of splits that I think have to be solved at the level of having like the framework in which you can also derive those positions as kind of like choices.
I think it's a really good example.
Yeah.
I would say like
this appears as choices that people have to choose within the space and ways to divide it, and then it becomes clear why these perspectives are so incommensurable, but they are not intrinsically so.
Yeah, I think we can account for that, like in this idea that there's something about these internal tensions, right? So if you have an organization 1, organization 2, and 3, and they are structured very differently. One is like a party, the other is a small autonomous collective, and so on. It's easier to evaluate the deficiency of the other leftist organization, right, than to evaluate, let's say, what went wrong with you, or evaluate something regarding the world in general, right? There's something about this sort of diagnosis here. Like they are taking the wrong route. That seems the most visible one. I think that it's kind of connected with what you were saying, but again, I'm making a bit of a caricature of the argument.
It's connected to your book too.
Yes, it is. But leaving the self-promotion aside, I think that another way of also once you have all these kind of problems, right, which are, let's say, we can call them economic, social in a more broader sense of a sort of disintegration of social space, spatial, and temporal. So the contemporary world looks very bad. We have all these internal problems here, intrinsic problems. To deal with. And then the available solution seems to be either to rely on a saturated canon, meaning the solutions to all of this will come from the solutions given by previous movements. And of course, the more you can choose what is your preferred canon. Latin American struggle in the 60s, urban fight in Europe in the 68, 70s, Leninist struggle in Russia in the 1920s, Maoist peasantry in the 1950s. I don't know. You can choose your canon, but the fact that these conditions are different separate you from it. Actually turn that canon into something that is slightly saturated. Doesn't necessarily have the language to account for what you're going through because it wasn't developed in that context, right? It didn't have to name the things that we have to name. Or alternatively, you can politicize alternative frameworks, which are not political. So for example, well, if I need to solve all these problems and I have such a fractured and problematic political field, I can look to solutions in philosophy. So political philosophy will tell me what's common below all of this. Or you can look for science and try to turn Marxism into a scientific field which can derive the correct position kind of outside of these different situated positions. Or you can do, as many have been doing, go to anthropology and think that some other guys will save us from ourselves and so on. So art for a long time was also a sort of resource of strategies to solve political problems, right? So you can either go to previous canon from the left, or you can look for, let's say, non-canonical, but also kind of extra political approaches to all of this, right? They ultimately substitute coming up with a political framework that can deal with all of these things. And finally, I think that what we said in the beginning, of course, there is a lot of plurality. There's definitely many, many ways of organizing, but it's still very relevant that this kind of heterogeneity does not yield a global cohesion or a sort of accumulation of forces. So, for example, you can have a very interesting popular movement of the Gilets jaunes who are struggling under banners that concern work, employment, increase in employment places in Europe, and a climate change, which is also interesting movement, which is claiming for degrowth and therefore restructuring of industrial kind of complexes, which might lead to decrease in immediate job offers. And those things don't necessarily accumulate, right? One of the ways we discuss this, for example, another example, which I think is good for the Brazilian context, it hasn't happened this way yet, but it will, in my opinion. Defenders of the public democratic space and defenders of the decorum, of proper presentation and speech in the public spaces of politics, they're trying to kind of take out of the picture the sort of vulgar right-wing politicians, but there are also those struggling to bring, you know, a more popular representation of the country into the political sphere. Well, but there will come a time where a truck driver is elected to the house of whatever, or the Congresso, and he will speak more like the vulgar politicians of the right than the democratic, secular kind of polite people on the left. So it's not always that these vectors accumulate forces, right? In a complex society, what happens is that you can have many vectors doing things that are justified as leftist politics, but the sum of these vectors is actually something going some way that is none of the three, right? That goes somewhere that's, if not unwanted, at least unexpected. It has weird effects, right? I'm not sure if anyone wants to add more depressing news to this bunch of problems here before we move.
I'd maybe add also there's this kind of problem between the continuity of struggles, like you trying to like what happens afterwards, all sorts of, you know, like normally the struggles in are becoming like have this temporality that's really they start really quickly, they disperse, and they end also really fast, and you have, it's not clear after that happens what sort of thing you accumulate. Is related to the last point you made, but there's also like the opposite of that is when you bet then on formalization, on organization, you try to sustain something that survives this fast scale, and then you also left with problems of suddenly being, you know, just self-reproducing your own space. So I don't know how I would call that, but
there's some incompatibility between, let's say, popular revolt, temporality, and the consistency of I don't know, structured organization, something like this.
Yeah, it's something like that. On one hand, you might disconnect from the struggle. On the other hand, you just go too much with the struggle, and then you're suddenly lost by the very conditions that the struggle ends. So something like that.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, perhaps we could derive it as from this other stuff, but I think it's way too central not to be included.
That's a very good example because it speaks to that experimental aspect of the framework.
So with all of this, I think we got a good view of this point 1 and point 2, that there are both intrinsic open problems, both in political economy and political organization. There are issues of adaptability to new conditions. There are issues of a sort of weird pathology internal to the interpretations, internal to the different kind of parts of the left that have an easier time seeing each other's problems than seeing how they fit into this broader frame, right? So I think that this kind of covers 1 and 2. So moving to the more constructive point, right? And starting more from the point of view of this side here. So we're political economy, political organization. So we're kind of back to political economy, but trying to do it in a way that is more well suited to also discuss organization at some point, right? So very early on, we started with 2 kind of theses. These are like stuff that we worked on in different ways in 2016, 17, and so on. And they are actually quite connected with what happened in the circle of studies of idea and ideology. One is a sort of preliminary hypothesis, which I'm not even sure it was maintained in any meaningful way today. But at first, one of the ideas to bridge this problem was to say, well, what if we look for the theory of unconscious forms of collective organization? This sort of unconscious here is just to say kind of structural, something that is slightly indifferent to the whims of the individuals involved, right? So what if we find that this theory of more structural aspect of collective organization in the already existing theory of social forms that is part of the structural analysis of political economy? So what if we look at value theory as if it is just a particular theory of something which also has to do with localized political organization? So if you look at texts that I worked on, that Dennis worked on, but also other things that the Circle produced a long time ago, we had that kind of underlying hypothesis that somehow you learn how to deal with this intrinsic problems, things that have a sort of structure that impose themselves upon the organized militants, by looking at the way that forms impose themselves, for example, in value theory, the monetary theory, dynamics of capitalist accumulation, and so on, that we see in Capital. So there was a first kind of debate on the idea of, well, that kind of requires us to have a more ambivalent idea of what alienation means, because you can have some form of alienation which you would call fetishistic, in the sense that you are being determined by social forces that you misconstrue and mystify, or that are not really, let's say, they're kind of indifferent to whatever, or forming, more than indifferent, they also form the way that you deal with social reality. But there might be also other forms that are equally removed from your sort of immediate individual point of view, or self-transparent, conscious point of view, which require you to take this, to displace your perspective, but not necessarily to diminish your capacity for freedom, or to reinforce a diminished capacity for freedom, but sometimes to increment it, right? And I think that this already in the 2000s was a very big kind of project, and I think it was in a way continued by many different philosophical points of view and perspectives. Even today, like the humanist, the non-humanist, the transhumanist, the post-humanist, they all have that kind of feel to them in a way. But I think that there is a second preliminary hypothesis that was developed that helps to demarcate this a bit better and less philosophically. And I think it kind of points to not the question of what philosophy we want to adopt, but what concepts are we missing, right? And this hypothesis was first defined as the idea of an impersonal emancipation. So I just have here four options for how we think of the relation between, let's say, economy and politics, why not? Or economy and organization, or economy or structure and political activity. So the first one is one that defines domination. So P is personal, D is domination, I is impersonal, and E is emancipation. So personal domination requires personal emancipation. So what does this mean? Is the idea that, well, ultimately capitalism or our social world is run by certain people. The best way to understand why our lives are constrained the way they are is by looking at some people and relations between people. That's what defines the domination today. Well, and if we want to do something about it, we need people emancipating themselves from those people, right? So personal domination requires personal emancipation. That would be the first position. Well, you can have a second position that says, well, it's precisely because today we're ruled by personal domination. Capitalism extends a sort of, it's just slavery through other means and so on. It's precisely because of this that we need to espouse a more enlightened point of view, where we uphold a more impersonal form of social relations that do not discriminate people based on color, gender, and so on and so forth, that privileges a more scientific point of view, a rational point of view. So it's abstraction saving us from this excessive concrete relation, right? But you can have a third position, which says it's actually the inverse. The world is ruled by abstractions. It's ruled by an impersonal form of domination. If you look at people, you don't really see how this world is structured. Relations between people don't really disclose the structure of the world. You need to take a sort of more abstract point of view to see the structures that truly constrain people. And precisely because abstraction constrains us, we need to fight for more concrete ways of being, more immediate, less tainted or instrumental forms of relation. And that's, let's say, the strategy we should focus on. The emancipation should be focused on the immediate relation between people, precisely because capitalism is based on mediated relations between people, right? So the whole project, and this is why I think it's a good way to situate, is to develop a fourth position, which is not easy to find, as already developed, and that takes something from all of them, in a way. So the first thing is that it takes from position 3. It says, yes, you're right, that there is something impersonal in the way that capitalist form of dominations work. You shouldn't simply look at relations between people to see the most intelligible description of why the world is the way it is. So yes, we need a theory of impersonal domination. It takes from position 1 this arrow here, because it agrees with the idea that you should fight fire with fire. Well, if this is personal, this should be personal. It should be fought in the same level, so to speak, right? So it says, yes, we should be fighting on the same level. And it takes from the second position the idea that there is something like impersonal emancipation, an emancipation that doesn't necessarily equate personhood and freedom, right? Or concreteness and freedom. So with this, you construct all the terms for this fourth position. Does this mean that it substitutes all the others? Of course not. Probably it's a good thing to know how to navigate between all of them. And the real world is probably requires a virtuous mixing of all of this. But, well, if you don't know how to talk about this, you're missing an important leg of your little mechanism, right? But then the problem is, what do this, we know what these terms mean when they're separate, right? We know what impersonal domination means when it's conceived against personal emancipation as a sort of dualism. We know what impersonal emancipation means when we're criticizing personal relations of domination and ethnical groups and things like this in favor of a more enlightened tradition. But that dualism also gives meaning to the context, so to the concept. So we don't really know what this means when that's not the dualism we're interested in. What does that mean, right? So what does impersonal domination means in this context, and what does impersonal emancipation mean in this fourth term? And finally, we know what it means for personal things to cause personal things. We know what it means for relations between people, take relations between other people and put them in the guillotine and cut their heads off. Like, you can kind of see cause and effect in that case. But what does it mean to talk about cause and effect in this impersonal sense, right? So this kind of sets up the challenge in a way. Does this make sense?
Yeah, here's maybe some examples for the top left. Personal domination and personal emancipation. It's like you said, like a guillotine example, or, you know, getting rid of the offending parties, right? Personal domination and impersonal emancipation would be something like changing attitudes, I would say.
Or building strong institutions, right? Like, if the Constitution works, we're kind of protected from ourselves, right?
Yes, building some safeguards into the structure of society, maybe through laws that would prevent bad people from getting power, right? The unwanted individuals. And then impersonal domination to personal emancipation, I think that's more like finding kind of maybe spiritual or cultural forms of freedom.
Yeah.
And then the last one, we could say, I mean, an example that exists now would be maybe changing laws. But, you know, even that, it seems kind of fluctuates between personal domination and impersonal domination, right? Laws which address individuals, but they're, you know, what does it mean to make a law that changes the very structure of society to remove some kind of dominant effect?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the you know, the only example I can think of, I mean, just to go back, like I think it's a bit unfair to say direct action is how we should call. John suggested populism for the first. So personal domination and personal emancipation would be something like populism.
Four gives me the vibe of something like systemic or like structural, you know?
Yeah, but so just to take here what he said. So the second would be, what did you say, John? I'm having trouble with the chat.
Reformism.
Like constitutional reformism, any kind of legalistic approach.
Yeah, like reformism could go there, but I think
technocracy also, I think.
Technocracy could go there as well. I think that, for example, you can have like lifestyle changes in point 3. You can have communities, right? Like utopian communities that are removed from this rule of abstraction, and where you have a more spiritual or a different kind of more direct relation with the people that are there, right? And I think that I agree that, I mean, it's good to see that we can distinguish something we could call systemic change with this fourth. But I think that to go back to what Dennis suggested, I think that the hard thing to think about is that you want to say something like a law, but you don't want to say, I think we don't want to say law, we want to say logic. right? You need to do something that is slightly more intrinsic or structural than a law, because a law, in reality, it's determined by material conditions of the same system, right? So, for example, for most of the theorists of impersonal domination, to develop new laws is to develop laws under the constraint of those impersonal structures. So it doesn't really get you very far, right? So again, it's a good way of determining a theory of systemic change that already comes with three terms, right? You want to be able to talk about structural, systemic kind of logic of the world you're in that's not confused with personal relations. You want to talk about something impersonal, but you don't want that something, you can't really just have a empty concept, because it needs to be tied together with a causal or implicative structure with the domination structure, right? So you need to be able to say something like something systemic causes something systemic, right? So it is a big challenge. I mean, I don't think we need to have a name for this, but it's a name that, if you look at it carefully, it's already connecting organization and economy.
Doesn't like the historical communes normally deal with that? Like, I don't know, the Zapatist movement or...
Yeah, I think that's where we would find something like this, because it's like the Soviets, the communes, like in the plural, right? If you take one commune, it's a personal emancipatory project. If you need to bind communes together in such a way that relations between communes are irreducible to relations between people in the commune, right? Then you're starting to talk about a new logic, right? So, for example, if I'm alone in a commune in the fields with my friends, and we decide that we don't want to do something, right? We want to express our concrete personal freedom. Well, if it's just that project, that's fine, that's our problem. But if your commune is connected with others, or if many Soviets are connected amongst themselves, you are still constrained by others outside of your purview, even if that constraint is guaranteeing your incrementing freedom. So there is a level of emancipation and greater freedom, but it's conditioned on an impersonal relation with people you don't know, with structures which are not, let's say, reducible to the desire of the people involved, right? So yeah, that's where I would look for examples.
But doesn't the transformation of socialism to communism is also, like, for example?
Yeah, but that didn't happen. So there's that catch to find examples. But yes, I'm happy you went. I'm happy that's an example for you.
I think this bridges a bit also with the principal, non-principal filters. Like, you could also say that the personal is also like fetishistic and principal forms of mediation, and then the impersonal dimension is finding forms that do not rely on some sort of like personhood or like central state or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, especially because both here, I mean, I think that the principal aspect is actually quite clear here as well, because the only way for like the sort of reformist Republican ideals of enlightenment to be the way out, right, is that they appear as one. They're always unified, usually with the state behind them, right? But I think that in any case, I mean, this was a tentative thing that we developed a long time ago, but it's good just to clarify that there's a lot to learn from each of them, right? We took this from this, we took this from this, we took this from this to come up with this little structure. And we're still saying that these other three kind of implicative structures, they might be useful. We're just saying that it's interesting to see how there is no theory of this. What's the name of this theory? Who are the main theorists? Or What are the?
It's also I think from our perspective the most complex, right?
Yeah, which makes it more fun as well to investigate.
Yeah.
So with that said, right, I think that there were three initial kind of researches based on this idea of impersonal emancipation. And I think Caron left, but I mean, I think one of them, which he worked along, when I met him, he was working on this, which is a sort of philosophical and aesthetic investigation into the connection between freedom and constructive points of view. So why constructive points of view? Because you need to arrive at this point of view. It's not given. If it is impersonal, there is, right, the basic distinction between personal and impersonal here could be the fact that it is not given to be seen with your own eyes, right? It's not something you can simply trust perception to organize that structure in its most intelligible way. It takes some work to go from where you are to the point of view in which you increase your capacity to see the thing, right? And Caron was working, especially in music, with a lot of experiments that had to do with structures that you had to take a weirdly intellectual or conceptual sensibility in order to recompose their inner structure. I was working on, let's say, the aesthetic sensibility related to political economy. Other fields were also connected here, but there was Dennis and I worked for a long time within Lacan and this sort of Žižekian approach with this similar problem of what does it mean to connect freedom not to your own point of view, but with a weird point of view that you don't recognize yourself from, right? But it was more of a philosophical and perhaps also aesthetic path. But then a couple of years after, we started searching for two things. And I think one was to search for a Marxist framework, or for others, whoever who could help us out finding concrete theorizations of this structure, right? Search for Marxist frameworks that allow for a more immanent connection between value theory and political practice, imagining that, well, impersonal domination is usually a theory that uses value theory in a way, right? And political practice and political organization as being the field we want to increment with this kind of schema, right? And at the same time, especially Dennis started working on a Badiou-inspired redescription of the critique of political and economy in terms that make impersonal domination, so make this difficult point of view you need to take to increase social intelligibility, coextensive with forms of subjective experimentation. So I'm taking this, it's, of course, if you read our texts back from the day, they look much less clear in this regard, but in a certain way, translating Marx in terms of this objective phenomenology is already translating Marx into terms that are more conductive to talking about impersonal emancipation, which is something that not only Zizek and, let's say, in human neo-rationalists, but Badiou himself also have something to say about what it means that freedom is more intelligible from another point of view rather than your own, right?
I think that's exactly one of the best points of the primer, exactly that third one, exactly, right?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, this is the, I think that what I'll try to show now, I'll leave this aside for a bit. And I'll try to show first that we did find such a framework, and second, that we try to make it compatible with this and use it to enrich this perspective here, right? So, so we found a theory that seems to go in that direction, and no wonder it has the title of, right, being a transcendental theory of world history. It has all the ambition, all the craziness you would expect of anyone working under that paradigm, which is on the one hand stating, look, you shouldn't be looking at social formations from not from your immediate point of view, as if it was organized by relations between people, right? But also not from a one single ahistorical or at least general schema of how it's structured. So what Karatani showed us, to be very blunt, is first that it is possible to uphold a multi-logical theory of social formations, right? Meaning it has more than one logical theory inside of it, and that it therefore allows us to already combine well-established theories of value, social contract, and gift economies, and kind of free associations of certain philosophical ideas around freedom and so on, into a common framework. So the first thing that you find then is it is already a sort of enrichment of the critique of political economy, not in the sense of adding more content to it, but reframing it in a way that it becomes a richer theory, right? It has space for many logics inside one social formation. It already combines and explains conflicts between different theorists and different ways of organizing. And second, we found out that this theory is capable of making the history of political struggle and organization more intelligible, because these logics also apply to socialist forms of organizing. So it's not only more general in the sense of enriching our description of political economy, but it also has the, let's say, nice kind of hints that it can also have a better relation with organization, right? And it's called a Transcendental Theory because in this theory that Karatani develops, we can derive singular historical characteristics out of the interplay between more general and basic logical features that these historical formations have in common. So the theory is pretty much made of 4 modes of intercourse or 4 modes of exchange, right? Reciprocity, contract structure, value structure, and free association, plus a theory of structure, a theory of how these modes are related. What is the dominant mode? How conflicts are solved? Are these modes inconsistent in their pure form or not? And why do they need each other? And how are they related? And so on. So a singular social formation in this theory is actually composed of a mixture of these 4 modes, right? And to see them in their kind of pure form, to understand their logic, you kind of need to bracket the others and just look at one of them kind of in artificial but clearer form. And so social formations are singular because they mix these 4 modes in different ways, right? And I would add here something that I didn't, which is it's not only a theory of structure. Oh, fucking hell. It's not only a theory of structure that it adds, it's also spatial and temporal theory, right? So these are spatialized as well. So a social formation mixes these 4 modes. They are also declined and changed depending on how close to the center of that formation you are, and the relation with other formations and what came before. But the core are these 4 logics and how they relate, right? So using Karatani's approach, and this was something that was developed kind of on the side of our group, but I did a presentation on this a couple of months ago. So using Karatani's approach, we developed a similar model for the analysis of the challenges faced by political organizations in this time of world peripherization, right? So specific analysis of political organization, like taking into consideration all those problems that we saw before, and kind of bundling them under this title of world peripherization. So this theory, or this kind of sketchy model, defines a collective organization as a mixture of at least 3 social logics. So we call like economic, institutional, and communitarian, but it's pretty much the same as value, state, and reciprocity, right? Plus some form of negation of the overarching social formation it is part of. So you arrive at this kind of description of political organization in a way that, on the one hand, distinguishes, right? You have like a big social formation, and you have all the tools with Karatani, the 4 modes and their specific way of relating to define the singularity of a social formation. Inside the social formation, for example, you might have an organization. That organization, therefore, is itself constructed from these different modes, A, B, C, and D. But if it is a political organization, it has some negative relation to that social formation, right? Negation. So not only this, so we show that there is a more immanent move from the analysis of economy, an already enriched analysis of political economy, to a now localized analysis of political organization. But this, and that this local analysis of political organization still uses a lot of the material that is conceptual material that is useful to talk about these large structures. So besides this, we also show that the way that we construct this kind of respects 6 general premises. So,
sorry, Gabriel, what is mode D for the political organization? What's the equivalent of mode D?
Yeah, there is a small change. This is an important topic. Karatani has a transcendental theory of what he calls mode D, right? So for him, there is an already constituted kind of regulative ideal, which is socialism. But rather than adopt the premise that there already exists fully fledged, fully formed, something that we have never seen, and that he maintains as a philosopher that exists, we just describe mode D locally. So what is the local appearance of mode D? Well, the fact that it negates the other 3 somehow. It's not the other 3. So rather than give this total description or philosophical abstract description of what it is that we're aiming for, we're reducing the consistency of this 4th mode to be the constructed consistency of whatever appears that negates A, B, and C, right?
Okay.
So it's a bit more prudent, let's say.
So this plus some form of negation is
doing that work, yeah.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, it might be a bit too much. I think that this is a big problem to discuss as well. Is this enough, or should we have, or is it perhaps kind of a stupid move because there's such a long history of political organization and all sorts of struggle? Shouldn't we just name the historical kind of weight of communal struggles with some sort of transcendental value, you know, and just
like a positive definition,
like a more positive definition? Yes, I think that there's not much to lose, because if ultimately there is in reality a positive definition, we'll arrive at it through this negative one at some point, right? It should emerge. But in doubt, I think it's better to start with something a bit more prudent and say, well, we don't know if a new way of social organization will truly be a continuation of the sum of previous political struggles, right?
So I don't know this in Karatani, but when he discusses mode D in actual social formations, not the organization, what kind of concrete example does he use? For example, go ahead.
Yeah, he uses 3 types of example mostly. Religious movements in imperial times, philosophy in ancient Greece, modern Europe, as a sort of philosophical ethics, really, and socialist cooperatives, communes, things like this in a more practical activist sense. So the history of this sort of gift that doesn't ask for anything in return would appear in those three ways. Religious, actually 4 ways: nomadic people, religious, radical religious ideas, philosophical ethics, and socialist politics.
Mm-hmm. So we can look for equivalent things in the organizational theory.
Yeah, that's also something that bothers me a bit, that mode D becomes this thing that applies to very, very different things in a way that it's still up to debate if they all go together so easily. So I don't think there's much to lose in being a bit more careful with how we arrive at a definition, especially in a time where, again, if we're trying to undo the weight of even leftist ideology, right? The idea that we already have this thing solved, putting them in the back seat and saying, okay, let's start with a more negative, pragmatic approach. If ultimately we find out that we were doing what everyone was doing all along, it's a good surprise, right? So, but we try to show that this way of applying Karatani to political organization, it keeps to these 6 kind of principles or premises. So it does not need to assume that there is an underlying unifying logic to leftist thinking. So it allows for the idea that there might be a very heterogeneous origin for leftist ideas, ways of politically organizing. So creating a common space for political organizations cannot be the same thing as returning to the unified origin where we kind of lost our way. There is no unified origin of leftist experimentation. Whatever unity you find or common space you find was constructed with some historical means, right? Second, it's a way of talking about it that doesn't equate what organizations say of themselves with their actual structure. It's a more structural description of organization than, say, if you call yourself a communist organization, you're a communist organization. Well, sure, you want to consider the fact that that's part of that organization, maintaining those identities, but you will look into how it's economically organized, culturally organized, institutionally organized, and see what is the actual structure, what it's actually doing, right? So besides, it will also look at how organizations relate to one another as relevant determinants of their inner structure. So some organizations are only, let's say, autonomist anarchists because there is some party that does a lot of crappy stuff that proves to them that anarchist autonomous organization is the best path. It's not because they are effective, but because the other organization is ineffective that they think they're on the right path, right? So part of the way you map your own dynamic can come from the way you're receiving information from other parts of this sort of ecology of organizations. We can show also that an organization can have different ways of functioning and negate or negotiate with these logics differently at different scales of their own structure. So a party can be very radical in the grassroots and very reformist in a upper level, right? So it's kind of net effect is reformist, but if you take its individual militants in a more grassroots way, they're all very radical. But somehow it always ends up being kind of just going with the reformist flow, right? Furthermore, it also has space to show that concepts can function both as theoretical as well as identificatory operators. So once you take into account the problem of cognitive mapping, the problem of situating your organization and your effects in the world, you can see that sometimes theory is there to help you assess what you do and take risks and understand what happened and so on, to situate you in the world, but sometimes it's doing the opposite. It's situating the world inside the organization. So rather than helping you navigate the world outside, it's bringing the world outside in and making you feel like well, I'm a radical because I believe in this and that, right? So can also, the same concepts can function as means to walk around and means to just map everything that is around you without having to leave your room, right? And finally, it's a way of describing everything that has so little content, right? It's not saying what an organization is, it's not saying how you should do things, but it's also submitting the evaluation of if this model is good to its usefulness. So ultimately, you should check if this is good by seeing if it helps to clarify and render things intelligible from the situated perspective of political practice. So again, it keeps that experimental point kind of thread open, because ultimately it is useful if it helps to make more things intelligible, right? So with all of this in mind, we moved, to go back to that diagram, right? We moved from the critique of problems in political economy, problems in political organization. We found with Karatani a approach to political economy which deals with some of these problems, is enriched, it can say more and bring together frameworks which are not themselves Marxist in a way that makes the translation between them better, which also shows itself to be amenable to a treatment of political organization, to translate these ideas to political organization while keeping the difference between the two things alive, and also solving some of the problems that we face in the critique of our current paradigm, right? So at that moment, we're kind of in this point. So this is where we most recently arrived, I think. So yeah, I should have just gone to this slide, right? So some impasses of critique of political economy have a new promising description with Karatani's work. Some impasses of political organization get redescribed or reassessed with this model we were talking about. We've been developing and searching for new formal resources from philosophy, mathematics, physics, art, and so on. Resources that can help us kind of give a new grammar to this theoretical frame we've been talking about. And now we have the problem, like the concrete problem at hand. We want to develop something which constrains the formal resources and general concepts to only refer to matters at hand. So we don't want to simply take category theory or philosophy and just work within those things. We want to find how to restrain them so that they speak of the things that we are interested in speaking about, right? So there is some movement to go this way. But as we do this, we need other things to happen at the same time. This new thing needs to reconstruct the theory of world history that Karatani presented and solve some of its problems, clarify what it is, show that it is actually quite consistent with Marx and so on, and also include that model or a better version of that model that we were just talking about. So that gives us, let's say, a new way of looking at the problem that this text that Dennis and I were working on starts trying to address more hands-on. I think that this is also this shouldn't be kind of dismissed. I didn't talk that much about this, but I think that recently we've been talking a lot about this arrow. What does it mean to solve this problem, not with the most upper bound theory, but with the least upper bound theory, right? The least most general theory of the phenomena we're interested, rather than the most general. It sometimes requires you to reduce things beyond the justifiable point that would be philosophically justifiable, I guess. So the least most general theory is a good formulation. So this brings us then to the concrete stuff that we did, right? So the primer on political phenomenology, it's at first glance a reconstruction of the first volume of Marx Capital in a specific way, which is as a subsystem of a more general theory. And this more general theory has some characteristics, right? First, it uses this objective phenomenology approach as a mean to talk about impersonal standpoints. So we use this philosophical idea of objective phenomenology, that the differences that make a difference are not necessarily differences that make a difference to us, right? Which is a way of understanding that idea that phenomena appear to other phenomena, doesn't necessarily appear to us, right? Or not always. As a way to reinterpret this old idea of impersonal emancipation, impersonal domination, well, this impersonal realm, right? Second, this paper tries to reconstruct Karatani's 4 modes of intercourse within a common formal grammar. So rather than simply talk about historically they exist, as he does, or socially describing them, we try to find a common grammar, which, even though it's a very small group of concepts, it can be specified to give you the logic of each of those 4 modes, right? In the case, it's as I already made the proviso, it's not really the 4 modes, it's 3 modes plus negation, right? Third, it can, with the same sort of machinery, we can talk about organizational experiments, what does it mean to organize, and this is clear from the paper only insofar as the whole of capital is described using a compositional approach, which is, it's weirdly enough, it's more intuitive when you think about organization than when you think about economies. So the hard job was to turn economic theory into a compositional theory, where value is compositional, capital is compositional. It's weird to think about these social relations in those terms, where it's easier to think about composition, where it's actually already a term in political organization and many people coming together, forming a group, and so on and so forth, right? So, but it makes that it allows for that translation. Then a very important point I will discuss briefly in a moment, which is it describes the money form as a particular case of a general theory of social intelligibility or social measure, right? So when we reconstruct Marx's Capital in this way, the main goggles to see impersonal domination, which is to look at the world from the perspective of money and commodities, becomes one goggle amongst many possible goggles to see social reality in a way that is not differences that make a difference to individuals, right? It also brings together, and I think this will become clearer later on, object composition. So how objects are composed, under which logic things are grouped together and related to one another, and what you can intervene upon. So already from the economic point of view, we get to see that depending on how objects are created, so depending on what makes up this object, so objects in the sense of a bundle of commodities, a bundle of money, a bundle of a bunch of some quantity of capital, some capitalist process of accumulation, some monopolistic process. So different scales of analysis, they also turn, let's say, what can interact with them. They with different ways of composing objects come different interactional possibilities, right? If you remember our little schema there, this has everything to do with this, right? Depending on how this impersonal space is composed, this interventionist principle changes together with it, right? Also, it discerns political interventions and challenges to political consistency. I think this is not really clear in the primer so much, just in the conclusion, but from the way we did this, it's easier to see the difference between, to use a bit of the specific language of Badiou and so on, a political transformation that only affects, like it's eternal in its, let's say, availability. Of course, let's say the Paris Commune will inspire and it's intelligible and it has something that is eternal, but in its own conjuncture, it's kind of an end in itself, right? It happens, concerns those people. It's a political event against an economic structure. But we can also define within this framework what a political economical event would look like, right? What added conditions political processes need to abide to so that they are not simply politically intervening, but let's say affecting the economic structure as well. Not only that, but we also address some open themes in the critique of political economy. So we provide a new theory of abstract labor. I think we did enough to show that there is a new treatment of the transformation problem that you can do with this framework. And it avoids some deadlocks of contemporary political organization. And I just added reliance on the future here, because I think this is actually a very profound and poorly explored aspect of all of this, which is this sort of experimental approach to politics. It doesn't really, of course, it's temporally and spatially based, but because of this compositional approach and the grammar in which we're discussing this, and this idea of making things visible and the problem of going from the local to the global having a sort of primacy, you can see that futurity and this kind of reliance on a future or a teleological advancement of society, or the idea that history is on our side or something like this, you don't need any of those things for the political vision to be interesting. So it's interesting to see a sort of political perspective start to develop from this, where I'll get back to this later. I made a crazy kind of proposal there that I think we can derive from this. You know that there is this whole doctrine of computational Trinitarianism, right? Which binds together computation, proofs, and what's the third thing? Types, right? And say they are all kind of the same. It's kind of a identification of three different things, and when you treat them, the three different things as the same, it opens a very interesting approach to philosophy of computation and so on. And I think that there's something like an organizational Trinitarianism, which says something like this: social knowledge is the same as let me just remember how I wrote this down, which I think was a good formulation. Yeah, social knowledge is the same as political intervention, which is the same as organizational structure. So you only know things in social reality if you have a way of intervening upon them, and you only have a way of intervening upon them if there is some organizational structure which is conductive to that intervention, which implies that you have this social knowledge. So these things are kind of the same, but seen from different perspectives. And it's the most nerdy kind of metaphor, but yeah, it's there now. But anyway, so yeah, so we try to do all of this in the primer one way or another. I think that you can find these things there without looking too hard for them. Yeah, there's a link there to what computational Trinitarianism means. Thanks, Yasher. But it's just this idea that there is a connection between, as I said here, right? How things are composed, your capacity to intervene upon them, and how intelligible they are. So the sort of epistemological dimension of politics, the kind of causal dimension of politics, right? And this organizational dimension of politics, they're pretty much correlated.
What's the one on the right? What's the one on the very right again?
This one here, epistemological.
Epistemological. Okay.
Yeah, causal, epistemological, and organizational, right? Which doesn't mean you cannot have knowledge. Just to make clear, like, I'm not saying you can only know if you change it, but you can only socially know if you're capable of changing. Like, there's a small difference there. It's such a bluff not going to go too much into it, but I think it's a nice slogan to push. So very briefly, since we're running out of time, this is what the primer does. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but just to show that it's divided into these kind of 4 kind of points. The first little section states the sort of impersonal point of view. From section 2 to section 7, we reconstruct the value theory as a particular form of social intelligibility within the value mode C, right? Then section 8 points to what is the general theory of a complex social formation. So in this paper, we're only focused on mode C, but we kind of point out to a very basic approach on how to deal with the complete thing, right? For Karatani, you would need these 3 or 4 modes at the same time. So we at least point out that this is consistent with this. And then we reconstruct the whole theory of surplus value in Capital Volume 1 from the standpoint of this composition and this cooperative surplus. So you kind of get to see how the organizational point of view, or this sort of local structures of how people are organized cooperatively under specific constraints given by the productive system. Yes, it vibes very well with whole. I was thinking of that. So we get to show that with this perspective, not only do we show that money is a particular goggle at looking at the real social world, but also that we're building the theory from the ground up in a way that organization was always at the core. So surplus value, to be very, very brief, we show that you can derive the theory of surplus value from a theory of how you extract from below the composition of means of production and labor. So you have a set of labor and a set of means of production. You have, for example, many laborers here. You have the set of all ways they can be combined together, right? And combined with the means of production. This set here is larger than these sets. And surplus appears from the difference between the cooperative capacity of people and their individual value as laborers, right? So, of course, we show like relative absolute surplus and the surplus extracted out of time, but we show that the broader theory is the theory of this sort of cooperative surplus. So this actually requires us to work. I mean, I'm not sure if this made sense to everyone, but I'll return to this now in a more detailed way, but presenting it slightly different to also introduce what John has been doing, what Thiago was doing, and I've been working with him. So there is a general strategy behind all of this. It kind of requires these 4 steps to arrive at a construction like this. It has 4 underlying steps behind it, I think, being kind of vague. The first is that you make a hypothesis on what is the operational basis, right? What is the logic, kind of very vaguely described, of the difference that make a difference in this logical space you want to describe. So you're not going to be able to take this from anywhere, any empirical way, right? It's just like the value theory by Marx. It's not really empirical. It requires you to kind of make a hypothesis about how these things work and then see what happens in a way. Once you have this sort of basic transcendental principle, right, which is in itself inconsistent, you try to show under which conditions that logic would acquire logical consistency, right, through what we call a combination of atomic atomic composition. So if you're trying to explain, for example, how commodities can consist and the exchange between commodities can be consistent. You need to show how the way an object is composed, meaning their internal differences, are related or feed off and also determine how they are externally related, right? So rather than just asking how A and B relate, you need to ask, how do the parts of A make up A and the parts of B make up B such that A and B relate, right? So this is, let's say, the atomic view, and this is the sort of relational view. And we need to show that these two things need to kind of work together for this thing to locally consist. Locally consist meaning that doesn't mean that everywhere it will be perfectly coherent and the logical space is consistent, but to start acquiring some consistency, right? Then you need to find a way we kind of show that by latching this logical form into a material substrate, you can generalize this local consistency beyond a certain immediate frame, right? I'll give an example very quickly of how we did this. But once you arrive at this point, so the logic components that make up the parts of objects, they negotiate and they feed off the material constitution of the things, of the very ontological substrate of these spaces. This is, again, I know, guys, that this is, for those who haven't really heard a lot on this topic, this might sound a bit weird, but anyway. And then we show that with this generalization in place, you can start talking about a sort of dynamic theory of how these things, so you have an object and another object, and they are composed in such a way that they can relate to each other and so on. Well, you can come up with a bigger object that has this object inside. And this big object now relates to another type of big object, and so on and so forth. So you have scalar transformations that also affect qualitatively what can relate to what in a dynamic way, right? So just to go very quickly over this. So for our capitalist transcendental or value transcendental, we call TC, we showed what is a commodity space where commodities beget commodities. We showed our kind of hypothetical candidate for this exchange function between any two commodities and any two parts of commodities. We show that just because A exchanges with B and doesn't exchange totally with C, that doesn't mean we know at this point if C and B exchange as well, so it's inconsistent, right? We show that once you have the money form, you can guarantee that wherever A and B you put here, there is some translation of an amount of money to a specific amount of money that can see this relation happening, right? Or give you the specific degree to which they are translatable or they are exchangeable, right? So you start seeing with a specific goggle, right? A specific perspective, the relations between commodities. We've shown that to generalize this beyond the local, the circulatory, the sphere of circulation needs to latch onto the sphere of production. And it's precisely by what happens at the level of production that this thing here becomes consistent, right? And this is already capital. Capital is defined as some amount of money that becomes another amount of money. Again, I'm not trying to explain the formalism, just show the steps that we took. And then we've shown that once you have this, so for example, this is our little one capital that turns one quantity of money into another. It can use the profits to become another quantity of capital that invests a new quantity and makes a new quantity. Well, this whole object here, which defines some organic composition, it is seen from a new perspective. And once it's seen in a new way or becomes a new object, it can also see its parts in a new way. So it's not simply scaling up, but the further you go into this new objects, the more you can redescribe the local ones as well, right? So I'm just showing this so I can very quickly show that what John has been doing and Thiago and I fits very nicely into this picture. So, for example, if we start with TB, John, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just trying to be very, very kind of quick with this, but to show that the connections are there. You can find a hypothesis on this operational basis with what John called this adherence function. And we thought about formulating, I added with a C here of contract, just to distinguish from affinity in the mode A. But while the exchange function can give you, right, if you have A and B, they can have a value from total exchange to zero exchange and any value in between. With the state layer, you either have a commitment or you don't have a commitment. It's a classical distinction, right? You can start from that inconsistent theory of commitments to ask about how to derive a local consistency. So you can start talking about how internal differences make up, let's say, a being composed of commitments, composed of adherences, right? Things belong to you, you belong to yourself. So it's a kind of theory of properties, which is pretty much a theory of predicates, like properties in the logical sense as well, right? So you can start constructing a theory of these local contracts and a theory of what sees people made up of these kind of contract compositions, right? And this is a way of introducing perhaps the problem of sovereignty there where the problem of money was in the logic of value, while respecting the differences, but going through the same strategy, right? We can, as John did very well, find a way to show that this logic of sovereignty, just like the logic of money, to become more generally consistent, it needs to latch on to some material substrate, right? To negotiate with the material constitution of things. So we could say the logic of property requires us to find the logic of resources, which is, let's say, the production of property or the distribution of property, right? So it provides us a connection between the logic of sovereignty and the sort of political logic of contracts and rights and so on, with logistic undertone, right? So while we had in the other case a theory of, let's say, money, and here you have labor and means of production and so on, right? You could say something like a theory of property here on top, and a theory of, let's say, logistical and resource kind of structures at the bottom. Well, it doesn't matter if you have this property and this entitles you to this other thing, or there's some alienation of properties. If there is no infrastructure for this alienation to be maintained, guaranteed, or made available, right, through, let's say, trucks and roads, it doesn't matter. So it can only gain logical consistency in this more general sense if you find a way to, let's say, inform the material structures in accordance to that transcendental logic.
I like this interpretation.
Sorry, yeah?
I like this because you can I guess use this to interpret something like an Amazon or something as a mixture of TB and TC, right?
Yeah.
In itself, even though it is like of TC, it has like ballooned to a degree where it like took on logistical aspects and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, it's very common for big companies to build the roads that they will use. They like get money from the government or make lobbies so that roads are put in place so that the commodities can circulate better, right? I mean, not to speak about big geopolitical conflicts and so on, which I think I think John already started to show very nicely that these things fit together very nicely. So this geopolitical problems, large-scale problems of recognition between states or misrecognition or war that happens through logistical channels, it all shows that you can move between these different kind of levels of construction of the theory in a very similar way as we did with mode C, right? And we can do the same for TA. And this is something I've been doing with Thiago. I'm going to go very quickly over this because I know we're already out of time. So we also found a certain hypothesis for this general logical space, which we've been using this formula, which only gives you 3 values, right? There is a lot of literature in anthropology on how the application of something very similar to this in places where there is no complete social formation, or where social formation never goes beyond the stage of some inconsistency, that this creates a sort of inconsistent perspectival space, meaning that, for example, I might see you as part of my community, and I see, for example, this person as part of my inner family, and I see this person here as an other, but nothing guarantees, like from the outside, right? But nothing guarantees that this guy here sees me as a two. He might see me as the same as him. And there is a lot of interesting literature on this weird perspectives that don't really match, and who is considered to be different or the same depending on where you're seeing them from and when, right? We can also use this, and we already started sketching this, to show that at this very basic level, you can construct with this kind of topology of three types of space, the basic topology of three types of society: animistic societies, totemistic societies, and naturalistic, or kind of the basis for the sort of Western scientific approach or whatever. We can show how this inconsistent space moves to, there is a derivation of local consistency in Lévi-Strauss's theory of restricted reciprocity, where what elementary form of kinship appears to give a sort of consistency to these perspectives. So this is our translation of Lévi-Strauss's theory of elementary form of kinship, where one man has one sister and the other man has another sister, and man one gives his sister to man two and vice versa. And if you look at it, it's very nicely formalizable in this way, that man one gives his sister because it's like giving a part of himself. It's zero. It's like the same. Man two, this is also zero. The sister of the first guy becomes part of the interior of the second guy, becomes like a couple, and the same on this side. And if this is the case, then they too have a kind of stable relation of otherness to one another. So it's a minimal structure that kind of maps out the three values of the logic, and it fits very well, and also helps us to describe why women appear at the level of the gift in some societies in a way that's very similar to money and to the sovereign in the other logics, allowing for this sort of exchange consistency, right? We show that latching onto material substrates, which is what Lévi-Strauss calls generalized reciprocity, in many societies has to do with turning that dual relation of exchange into an open exchange system. So I can give you my sister and you give your sister to someone else, and so on and so forth. Or I give you a gift, you give your gift to a third party, not to me, as long as this gift structure respects certain generational structures. So actual reproduction of people, and who is the mother of who is the father of who, and so on. This becomes to reciprocity what logistics is to property and sovereignty, and what production is to commodity. The underlying ontological substrate that you negotiate with so that your logical space can be generalized. And there's also a very nice interpretation of these perspective structures on social spaces that we can also give, but I won't go into it just so we don't lose time. And we also started showing that you can also interpret the canonical formula of myths. Is something I was talking to Yasha and Dennis the other day about, using the same formalism, and show that it has a sort of function of rendering intelligible for a certain group of myths what another group of myths is, how it's structured. So it goes back to that idea of larger objects that get to see and interact with other equally composed object structures, right? So, okay, I just already said too much, but with all of this, we get to this picture here, which I think is where we're currently at the level of this development. You have three different transcendental structures. They are internally recomposable, so they generate new objects inside of themselves, right? So you have small scale, medium scale, large scale structures in all of them. They can transform themselves internally in very radical ways. You have one which is maximally reaching, which we call the dominant one, right? Meaning that it has the furthest capacity for intelligibility of the world when compared to the others. But you have this big object here in the middle. And it is an object which is the actual social formation, which takes elements from all of these logics, and it's irreducible to any given transcendental, right? So, for example, we're talking about Amazon. Amazon is an object in our contemporary capitalist formation. It's true that if you reduce it to TC, it's the best reduction to do, but it's still a reduction because, as Yasha was saying, if you consider it as a mixture of TC and TB, considering logistics at the same time that you're considering value and capital, you see more of it. But at the same time, if you don't consider, for example, work relations of unemployed or poorly underemployed people that are constantly gathered, like in the Nomadland movie, right? If you don't take these other relations into consideration, you also see a bit less. So ultimately, this object is kind of composed of all these logics. And if you treat it by only one of them, you always see less than the object itself. The theory of this is totally underdeveloped thus far. I have a hint that this guy here has interesting formal tools to develop this, because the name of this structure here is a Borromean object in a weird category I forgot. Weirdly enough, without talking about this, right, we arrive at this can be called a Borromean object by this René Guittard guy, but it's also how Karatani calls it. And by chance, the two agree on this. And we arrive at this structure without considering any of them. So it's a very nice kind of finding that the thing we are ultimately describing is not only coherent with Karatani in a way, but it's also coherent with what a weird Lacanian mathematician is also doing, right? So with this, I think that we get to where we are right now in terms of this, where is it? This thing here, this political framework, right, which we were talking about. This is, let's say, a restricted view of a lot of formal machinery, restricted in such a way that it describes a lot of the richness of Marxist political economy, while opening space for discussing political organization, because we know that this finds a translation into a model for political organization, while being, let's say, the least general theory, the least upper general theory, right, of the thing. So it's minimally philosophically, maximally political until as far as we can see, right? So once we have all of this, and this is to conclude, so you guys don't have an overdose. So we can turn to political constructions and connect their internal structures. So the structure of political organizations, which we analyze in point 4, to their capacity to see and intervene at different social phenomena, which we define in point 3 with Karatani and developed with this whole construction right now, right? So this little schema here, you can start asking, given some object Y that appears here, right? It will be made up of TA, TC, TB. If it is a political organization, we are saying that it has a negative relation to some of these things, right? And we'll be able to say, depending on its structure, it will be able to see some parts of this bigger object and not see others, right? You see the point? Like with this crazy machinery we developed, we can make claims, or at least tentative claims of the form, if you want to be able to render socially intelligible some complex phenomena, you need to be able to construct something of a certain form of complexity as well. So there is a connection between what you construct in the sense of its internal structure, and depending on its internal structure, it will have some level of determination on what it gets to see and intervene upon. So we can start asking certain questions, certain new questions about political intervention. For example, which logical space has its that organization's basic structure challenged? So what logical space was challenged by a political process? Is a process that negates communal, institutional, value structures? Which value structures under or communal or institutional aspects within each transcendental, right? Does this process rely on other logics in order to take its consistency? So is it negating some logistical system by further reinforcing a communitarian one? Or is it able to negate both logistics and community at the same time, right? Do other organizations make a difference in this process? Or given a certain organization structure, what other type of organizations make the same difference as it makes in such a way that they might be composable together and form a kind of ecological space, right? Through which means do militants take up the point of view of their organization? So how do you exceed or elevate to the impersonal point of view under which things make a difference to your organization? And how do you reduce it back to your private perspective, right? What kind of tension is produced between the level of effectivity of the process, meaning which sort of behaviors you need to make in order to make a difference, and the personal redescription of the functioning of the organization. So how you need to justify it personally to yourself in order to remain there, for example. We can start talking about, and I added a bunch of versions here, you can start talking about, sure, you have a social formation, right? You can have a site for novelty inside of it. And from this site, a new form might emerge. But where does it, how does it arrive at some consistency? For example, does it negate the value transcendental and reinforce A and B? Does it negate C and A and reinforce B? For example, a new law, right? Or some new institutional community, perhaps. Or it just reinforces some bonds between people. Or does it negate C and reinforce A and B under a new thing, which is neither one of the two, right? Or does it negate all of them in the name of something that is neither communal nor state nor value? And we can still make the distinction of, is this political novelty, let's say, subdominant in the sense that it's not maximally reaching? It's a novelty, for example, in the sense that it's developing a new political form, but it's kind of restricted in the reach. You don't get to see many things in a new way because of it. Or is it maximally reaching? It allows you to see more things than the capitalist transcendental allows you to see, right? So this for us would be a political event. And this thing here would be a political economical event. So we get to distinguish between, did you make a political intervention or a political intervention which forms a certain new economical or contributes to a new economical transcendental structure, right? So you get a more richness of description in this way. I'll just leave this now so we can end. I think this is the last slide. The other one is just other stuff. So to conclude, I mean, I think, as you guys can see, I definitely focused more on the stuff I was involved, but I tried to bring, I mean, besides John and Thiago's work, I think I tried to at least formulate things in a way that make it more coherent with the stuff that Caron and Pedro have been researching as well. But just to conclude, I think these are some of the partial results that we have thus far, right? First, not only is the individual perspective not well equipped to directly see social reality, so our critique of sort of personal emancipation. But a given social formation contains several composite measures of social intelligibility. So for a given social formation, you have money, sovereignty, you have myths, why not, right? Or narratives. They all partially see a social formation. And you only get to see the social formation kind of by considering them all together. But even though there are many, in the sense that there are many money, capital, labor, narratives, groups, states, sovereign, so on, still this doesn't exhaust the theory of possible constructions of social intelligibility or ways of measuring and getting to know this social space, right? So there's not only are there several, but they don't exhaust the possibility of constructing new organizational kind of fabrics, right? Of many organizations kind of composing together, within which other differences make a difference, right? Second, the theory of social measure or intelligibility is not totally distinct from the theory of causation. I think that this is a more polemic point of view, but I think it's an important one. Meaning, why not? Why getting to know reality, making it more intelligible, and changing reality are connected? Because of something we've been developing, which again, I didn't focus on it that much, but I think it's quite important, which is the instrumental basis of social resolutions, which is this idea of sort of scale dependence of our measurements, right? This scale dependence of measurements and the sort of scalar nature of the sort of language of phenomena that we've been developing means that there are material conditions for you to make adopt certain resolutions, right? So the means for social components to see one another, so the means for social components to register information, right, relates to their means of interaction with other social objects. I think that's the big statement. So your capacity to register information in the social world is connected with your capacity to interact with that social world. I think that's a big kind of bombastic hypothesis, which again, it gives a more concrete idea to this thing here, right? That your capacity to render this intelligible is connected to your capacity to render this effective, your intervention, which has an effect on what sort of organization you should be looking for, which is what I call here very cheeky, in a very cheeky way, organizational Trinitarianism or political Trinitarianism, where your knowledge, your actual social knowledge, not meaning scientific or textbook representation of social reality, but your capacity to really see stuff in that way, right? The description of these conditions are equivalent to the description of the conditions for political intervention, which are equivalent to the description of what organizational structure or the space of organizational structure, which is something that I think the primer already does some work in justifying this definition, but I think that this will pretty much be the topic of primer part 2 that Dennis and I at some point in the future will have to start working on. But I mean, it's just a weird interpretation of this combination of what it means to see things in some way, and which is the most intelligible way, what it means to interact with those things, right? And what it means to prepare yourself in your inner structure so that you can interact with those things. And finally, so for political processes to be considered experiments, so it's not action that needs to change in the sense that we need to act differently or we're going to tell people what to do, but rather that we need to find a new way to construct systems of organizations that filter what collectives do in such a way that even failed processes become irreversible. I think that's a good definition. Like, the problem that this kind of presents as a kind of underlying issue is, of course, you're not going to tell what people should do. The issue is, what is the underlying common background that we need to be working on and developing in such a way that even if what people do doesn't amount to anything, a protest doesn't go anywhere, well, that failed process needs to become itself irreversible, meaning you need to be able to extract some information, some relevant information out of it, right? So that others don't need to repeat what was already done, for example. So rather than a theory of direct, let's say, rather than statements of this theory having the form of, well, if we're saying all of this about capital, we're saying all of this about social structures, you should do this or you should do that. No, the point is, whatever it is you do, it should be possible to do it, or we should strive to do it in such a way that the differences you make a difference to the greatest amount of other organizations as possible, right? That's the difference, let's say, the practical difference between treating your political process as a single intervention, which counts with the background and the sort of natural perturbation of social life to accumulate power, as if we're making waves and the waves will necessarily add up and create larger waves through our movements. You kind of need to rely on a certain theory of fluids to guarantee that would be the case, right? So once you cannot trust that, what we're starting to be able to suggest with this theory is how should you do things while you're doing whatever you think should be done in such a way that the chances that this propagates and reverberates and coordinates with other organizations grows rather than diminishes. And to the point that we get to both learn something from these experiments, but not in the theoretical sense of just looking at them and saying something, but learn in the sense that they affect other political organizations. If they affect other political organizations, then you have something like an economic space, right? I had a kind of cheesy ending here with the fact that most of what we're talking about is already in the Communist Manifesto. If you just add one change to it, which is that Marx uses many times this idea of the movement as a whole, the proletarians as a whole, or the general results. And he makes many statements which I find absolutely beautiful about the communists not forming a separate party, not having separate interests, right? There is no positive content to a communist party that is different from other workers' party. There is no separate interest from the proletariat, which is the communist interest. There is no principle, which is a communist principle, which could shape or mold the proletarian movement, right? He says that the distinction is from that communists point out and bring out to the front common interests, and that in the various stages of development in which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represents the interest of the movement as a whole. So it's interesting that has no particular content, right? Looks for the common part, what is in common between them, connects it to some totality of the movement, and you right? Practically, he says it's the most advanced and resolute section, which I don't think it's. I mean, it's just an kind of ethical point of view, but it also suggests that it being a section of the working class parties means that you're inside, right? So I would put that this is a sort of principle of interior. You're not outside. So you're looking for the common part that he was talking about inside the working class parties. And let's not forget that in Marx's time, like Proudhon wrote party. Party just meant group. Party didn't mean political party formed institutionally, right? Even Proudhon used the word party, and he was definitely against institutional parties for most of his life. And so practically, it's interior and advanced within the movements, and theoretically, advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, conditions, and ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. Again, so it's again not a matter of having the right theory, right? But in the sense of having a clear understanding of condition, clear understanding of the results, not the principles, right? And a clear understanding of the, I don't know what he meant by line of march, perhaps a clear understanding of the strategy, right? Theoretical conclusions are not invented by communists, right? It's no way based on ideas or principles invented or discovered by this or that universal reformer. They express in general terms actual relations. So I don't know, I think that the thing we're developing here, if you take the fact that tragically, this whole that Marx was counting on, right? That guarantees common interest, that guarantee the movement as a whole, facilitates you talking about march conditions and general results, right? This whole is totally fractured today. It's not a given. Many people doing good things against the social establishment are not necessarily doing things that accumulate with one another towards the same direction. So rather than, though this remains, let's say, a very though I think that his general kind of description of the communist position as a sort of interior perspective to what already exists politically, not really giving general principles to anyone, but trying to find these common interests that point to the movement as a whole from the inside, right? It's just complicated because you can't really trust some overarching structures to lead us towards this so naturally. So I think that this is where experimentation and a more constructive point of view come into play, because as you find the common interests from inside by trying to connect to the totality, this will give you the theory, or it will give you the material to describe the world at large, right? But you cannot count on it from the get-go in a certain way. So, I mean, just to say that it's a bit forced, I would say, even though I think that this is still one of my favorite passages from Marx. It's perhaps a bit forced to connect it, but this concludes my rough account of what's been up to for the benefit of others. I'm not sure for the benefit of how many others, but I hope that for someone, or at least for us who are others as well, why not? But I think that's pretty much where we're at right now.
I like the last little bit. I mean, like on like practical terms too, because I feel like the primer starts to give us an idea of where to go institutionally to actually build, like to construct a point of view in common rather than to kind of like have an assumption of a point of view. So it does kind of, I think, give a direction.
Yeah, I think the reason why I added that quote at the end is because I think that it's easy to take from all this theoretical paraphernalia and so on, the idea that if this doesn't become statement, like if the end product are not statements of what people should be doing, that you have done something that is politically useless. But the very original definition of, you know, scientific communists in Marx's manifesto is not defined in terms of saying what people should be doing. It's defined by having the means such that when people are doing the many things they're always doing, there is a way to be very intimate with these processes and find ways to connect the common share of each of them, right? I think that there is a lot. I hope that at some time, in some time in the future, we can go into this, because my opinion, the biggest change that we're facing is that for a long time, this common share had a name. It was called work. Like if you have a certain definition of work that functions as this kind of common convergence point between better work conditions, better employment for everyone, power to the workers, women having right to work. It seemed like everything could converge into that kind of point of view. And
that's where like not like heterogeneity was turning into homogeneity because non-workers were becoming workers. So it was also,
and you have exactly, and with
it underpinned a lot of teleology actually, as they were able to say, oh look, this is where we're going to go. So
yeah, so a lot of conflicts could be solved by the promise of, you know, militarization of work, full mobilization of society. You know, you can solve conflicts between TA, TB, and TC by looking at a certain figure of work which mixes together ethical and communitarian dignity with you know, clear position in the economic sphere, with rights in this level of the state. But the moment that this figure of the sort of formal worker, it becomes clearer that it's more of a hiccup in recent history, that it seemed like it would generalize society at large and become the global figure. The moment you realize that it's actually a passing moment, and the overarching arc doesn't have that sort of principal way of filtering everything through, you know, those kind of basic building blocks. You need to come up with this. So even if you are clearly embedded in real political struggles, even if you are not molding them to external principles, you still need tools to recognize what could you call a common part, because it won't be a given. It might sometimes be goals, sometimes be methods, sometimes be the same people, sometimes be other things. And you need to have tools to talk about what it means for these things to start making a difference to one another, right?
And I think this goes back to what you were talking about in terms of all these things, so many post-colonial theories, social reproduction theories, critical race theories, like these being the things that aren't really being listened to, I guess. I'm also thinking about the symposium that just happened in listening, and a kind of like communist listening. And it does seem like Marxists have failed to listen to the problems out of which these theories have arisen in an adequate way. And that's a lot of what that passage in the manifesto seems to like really call for.
Yeah, I find that passage really surprising. Like if you hear about the Communist Manifesto, you think it's a manifesto with communist principles. And then you go into it and the guy has the most Zen-like definition of communism. It just puts the communist in a position, right? But it's not a philosophical position. It's like go along with people and tell them they are all part of the same thing. It's more tricky than that, right? How do you connect the shares of different heterogeneous movements? And even if you're not, let's say, at the forefront, you're not going to be the vanguard of any movement. I like that he uses the most resolute, but he doesn't use the vanguard or most important, because of course, you can't be at the same time not have just be part of these movements and be spearheading them. Of course, you're not going to be spearheading or be the forefront, but it's almost like just indexing each of them onto, let's say, the basic connective structure that allows them to feed off of each other, right? So, I mean, it does point to something which I think is quite down to earth in terms of having a practical counterpart. With that said, I mean, I'll have to cook dinner. And
some great stuff you left on. I think especially about the issue of the left connecting. I think, at least in America, I think it's very obvious that the right has a lot easier time getting over differences than the left. Even like
which is crazy, right?
Pseudo left that we have here, yeah. So
yeah, and I mean, even in that case, right? I mean, it's very hard to connect with somebody we call pseudo left. So, for example, we would need a theoretical framework in which you can treat, let's say, people who only do militant work for cultural principles without really affecting anything that touches on their economic or institutional places. You can define that as a kind of subsystem of a larger ecosystem of struggles. You might say other things about it, like, well, nothing that we make at other parts of this system affect this small ecosystem. Like nothing matters to it, and that might be considered a fault. But suddenly, it doesn't look like you need to frame it in terms of this path or that path. You can have these multiple things and then see how they can feed off each other. And again, take the common part of them, right? Which again only brings us back to why non-principal ultrafilters remain the underlying theoretical issue.
The holy grail for us.
The holy grail of absolutely abstract problems. But I try to connect also with some stuff, and the way I phrase this, I try to connect with some stuff from Hall as well, this kind of causation information. I hope it was also, you felt like it was there. Yeah, I hope anyone listening to seeing this video afterwards can understand anything of what we've been up to from this crazy presentation, but at least they will know it's crazy for sure.
It at least looks like it's coalescing around something.
Yeah, I think so too.
So
anyway, guys, I need to run. It was a pleasure and a marathon.
All right. Thanks,
It was awesome. Thanks, Gabriel.
bye guys. Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye, guys.